Hello, and welcome to Chrononauts, a science fiction literature history podcast. I am JM, and with me, as always, is Nate. Hey, Nate.
Hey, how you doing?
All right. So today, we are going on a sojourn into the interior of the Earth, and there's a lot to unpack here and a lot of stuff to go over, so we hope that you will enjoy this journey into subterranean realms. The notion of an underworld is present in nearly every world religion, so it's not a new phenomenon that arose sui generis a few hundred years ago. Edmund Halley tried to give this a more scientific basis in the 17th century. He proposed the theory of concentric spheres, as taken up by Mr. Sims. More on him later, much more on him. Halley proposed the inner sphere as a means of accounting for the variations in the Earth's magnetic poles, but drew further conclusions that the inner spheres must be illuminated somehow, and they might support life. He delivered his hypothesis to the Royal Society in 1691. Halley's inner spheres were 3 in number, each independently rotating on a north-south axis. Prior to this theory, though, there were other illusions. There was, for example, the 2-volume work by Athanasius Kircher, Mundus Subterraneus, an exhaustive compilation of knowledge and speculation about the Earth's interior, which was considered an influential book at this time. Kircher visited Sicily and witnessed volcanic eruptions. They fascinated him, and he actually had himself lowered into the Vesuvius crater when the volcano was active. Can't have been too active, because that could have been really dangerous, and he survived to write about it, but, you know.
Yeah, it certainly killed plenty of people in the ancient world, not just at Pompeii.
Oh, yeah. But this compendium includes some pretty wild speculations. Descriptions of the fiery center of the Earth. Even before this, a 13th century writer named Bartholomew from England speculated about a whirlpool at the North Pole, leading to a great hole. Kircher, though, thought that icy water from the pole poured into this hole, leading to the center of the Earth. As it came into contact with fire and great heat, the water poured through the interior, heated by what he called cosmic alchemical rays, and came out at the South Pole all warm and nice. He theorized this world had to be so, or else the oceans would either freeze or go putrid because of stagnation. Again, some of this doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, but, you know, these people were speculating in a time before a lot of real science in the modern sense was known.
And it did seem to be the religious default. I mean, works like Dante's Inferno are set in the center of the Earth as an underworld, and you see a similar kind of construction in Greco-Roman mythology as well, with Tartarus.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, and the Buddhists even have one like Artha.
Right, so it might be confirmation bias that they're looking for something that's already in the popular conscience.
Oh, definitely. A book that we're using for a lot of sourcing for this episode, David Standish's The History of the Hollow Earth, he brings up an interesting point that in the post-Copernican universe, which is a fairly recent thing at the time of his writing,
right,
the default position was that the other planets in the solar system were probably inhabited. We kind of assumed that that wasn't the case now. Like, we can kind of think, oh, that's something that came later. But, I mean, it makes sense, right? That if God put life here, why wouldn't he put life elsewhere?
And there's certainly a lot of speculation on that in a lot of the stories we've read so far, most of which have been set on the moon. But there's also speculation of life on Mars and Venus throughout the 19th century stories that we're going to see later.
For sure. Yeah, there was also the Sacred History of the Earth, which is written by someone named Thomas Burnet in 1681. And it describes how the Earth is a smooth, egg-like form, prone to great floods mentioned in biblical texts. And that this caused the Earth to tilt on its axis, basically causing the seasons and effectively destroying Eden. So this looks to me like a kind of an almost Gnostic Christianity sort of take on it,
right? Which
is funny because I don't think there was much knowledge of actual Gnostic texts in 1681, but yeah, he basically said the Earth's a bunch of slime sitting atop a watery interior with the holes caused by the constant beating down of the rays of the sun. It sort of slants towards this weird Gnosticism of imperfection kind of thing happening. Anyway, back to Halley, though. His hypothesis explained that the Earth, in fact, had 4 magnetic poles, unlike other magnets. Earth being itself, of course, a giant magnet. He comes up with several convincing-seeming arguments as to how this could be the case, but ultimately it comes down to the magical power of magnets. Halley then posits this inner world is likely habitable or inhabited, and he likens this also to the other planets, which might also be inhabited. Halley is rather optimistic about all this, and he's very defensive about it sometimes, apparently, in his text. He doesn't really know the answer to how such a place might be illuminated or warmed. He just kind of says, oh, maybe it's crystals or swamp gas, something like that. Or maybe each world has its own sun and stars. And he makes quotes to classical texts and so on to support his theory, like the Aeneid and the rape of Persephone. But then he kind of, being a seemingly rather self-aware person, he kind of points out, well, yeah, I know that's not really an argument, but people always quote poetry and scripture when they want to suit their purpose, so right. I'm going to do it too. So, an interesting, everybody knows about Halley's Comet, and that's kind of the only thing that people really know him for nowadays. Yeah. But he wrote a lot of stuff, and he was involved in a lot of projects, and this Hollow Earth thing seems to have been an obsession of his, even in the latter part of his life.
I didn't really look into this angle too much, but I think his theories on geomagnetism specifically, not any kind of hollow interior, but the ideas of magnetism did lead to some later developments in maritime navigation and compasses and things like that. So I could be mistaken.
No, I think you're right. I didn't read too much into that, but I think that it's a thing. But
yeah,
in the latter half of the 1710s, he had his final portrait taken, and he was holding a paper that in his portrait there that shows nested spheres. It's kind of weird that he would be, of all the things that he was interested in, he would have that in his hand almost like, yeah, I'm still here. I still believe in it. Yeah, so another possible proponent is 18th century Swiss mathematician Leonhard Euler, but it's kind of a lot of speculation, and this is kind of something that will come up again as we talk about this over the next spoilers. We're going to do another episode on this too, so we have another one coming up with more sort of later adventure stories, but one thing that does kind of come up a lot is that there is some weird conspiracy, wacky stuff around these concepts, and some things are ascribed to people that may not actually be true. For example, you could find some stuff on the internet on Euler's theories about this, but it seems hard to actually, that might not actually be in his corpus.
The sourcing is dubious, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that is the case, the odd case, I would say, about 2 of the 3 works we're going to be discussing tonight, is that a lot of people, well, I shouldn't say a lot of people, but some people don't view them as works as fiction. Some people think they are actual accounts of an underground world.
Yeah, definitely. And it's the whole fact and fiction thing has really been distorted a lot over all this. And, you know, we have quotes attributed to real people that may be taken out of context or may not exactly even be true. And we have real people saying things that are a little bit off the cuff maybe, and that we wouldn't really expect from them. There's a lot of names mentioned in connection with this, including Cotton Mather, who I didn't really know anything about until now, but apparently he's a major American figure in Massachusetts in the 17th century. Definitely somebody like that would give a sense of legitimacy to a lot of these ideas.
Sure. And the Standish book, I thought, did a really good job of kind of cutting through that layer of questionability surrounding the nature of some of these sources.
Yeah, he did. I'll talk a little bit later about the book itself, but another interesting difference that some of these theorizers have is that usually there's a hole at either pole that you can sort of go into, and when you travel that far north or south, you can enter one of these holes, and it'll either be this tumultuous whirlpool that'll suck you down, or it'll be very calm. It seems like mostly probably because it's very dramatic, people went for the whole whirlpool angle because it's probably more exciting. Somebody we're going to get into a little later, John Cleves Sims, who seems to have been a major proponent that actually helped really spread this concept through especially North America in
Right.
the 1820s.
Several decades after his death even, but we'll get to that story in a little bit.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely be talking about his story. For him, it was an actual, not a whirlpool or some kind of great maelstrom, but actually quite calm, and you might not even know that you were going inside, except it would inexplicably become warmer. And he had the kind of the sun being somehow reflected and purified by the upper layer of matter, I guess. And he said that certain birds or animals, in fact, come from inside, or they migrate there during certain times of the year and can't be found because during his time at least, the South Pole especially had not really been, well, the pole hadn't been visited, period, but even like the southern islands off of South America were just barely explored.
Right.
Just a lot of this is linked to expeditions that were attempted or almost attempted. There would be talk of immense riches and lots of good hunting and animals and things that could be harvested and so on, and it was considered something of scientific value. So I think, though, that it's definitely not only the scientific imagination, but the literary imagination that has been really captured by these tales. So what we have is a lot of literary works starting around the 1700s, early 1700s, where there were various speculations about what kind of lands might be inside the earth and what sort of inhabitants might dwell therein. So what we're going to do today is talk about some of the earlier examples of these works. Now, there are many examples that we're not going to get into.
Yeah, I'm sure we could spend the next 15 episodes doing nothing but Hollow Earth stories.
Yeah, and we're not going to because,
No.
I mean, although, and this is something that I think we talked about a little bit, sometimes the background to something is almost more interesting than the subjects themselves. And
Right.
like, although we did read some interesting stuff today, we picked examples that are influential and that are considered important. There's hundreds and hundreds of others that are maybe not that notable. It just seems to have become a real trend at a certain point in the 19th century, especially.
Yeah.
You get really popular examples like Jules Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth, which we are going to cover, not today, but next time. Of course, Edgar Rice Burroughs, we already sort of alluded to covering. We've been kind of teasing that one for a bit now, I think. This phenomenon, in fact, started a lot earlier than that. And I did write down some of the other examples, but I think that rather than go through them all, what we might just do is put up a list of works or something on the blogspot. That way, it's instead of just throwing out a whole bunch of names that people probably won't remember.
Yeah.
If people are actually interested in reading some of this stuff.
I guess two that I'd like to highlight at this point is the earliest known one, which is from 1723, written by Chez Gabriel Amalry. It has a very, very long title in French that basically translates as something like Relation of a Voyage to the Arctic and Antarctic Poles and to the Center of the Earth, which to my knowledge has not been translated into English yet. So that's another area for further scholarship and exploration.
I did want to bring up that other one. So 1788, Icosomerion.
Yes.
Yes.
Casanova.
So nowadays, there's two types of, I guess, this sort of literature that might interest people most, and those are the influential works and also the really weird ones. This sounds like a really weird one.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was written by Casanova, Jacques Casanova, and it runs to almost 2,000 pages.
Right.
And it's got a lot of weird. This brother and sister get shipwrecked somewhere, and they end up falling into this, I guess you could call it a Sims hole or something, and they end up in this underground place, and they foster a generation of descendants. And it's like this huge, mammoth, incestuous epic for the ages. I can't imagine how it lasts for 2,000 pages.
No.
But apparently it does.
Yeah.
Right. But Yeah,
So that's a thing.
that's a thing. A lot of these are pretty obscure. So, like, I imagine nobody reads Icosumerion today.
Right. Again, that's another one, to my knowledge, it has not been translated in English.
Right.
This one's Italian, but I'm constantly surprised at all the episodes we're going through, how many early French works we're finding that haven't been translated into English.
A lot of French stuff.
Yeah.
And yeah, the not translating French stuff is really weird to me. That's I mean, I understand maybe Catalan or something.
Right.
But
French is a major global language and has been for quite some time.
Yeah, and it's been long known to be a sort of forerunner of not just science fiction, but sort of like new wave ideals and like things that sort of connect to science fiction on a tangential level.
Right, Enlightenment philosophy, as well as, I guess, literature and satire in general. I mean, we talked about Voltaire a bit in the first episode, but most of his corpus was not science fiction adjacent. It was these kind of social critiques that you do see in a science fiction setting, but just with kind of different genre trappings.
Yes, definitely. Really, I have sort of skimmed over a lot of details about how things develop, but there are certain resources that we can point you to if you want to know more about the science behind the Hollow Earth. But for our purposes, suffice to say, there's an interesting world down there teeming with life, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Ludvig Holberg was a prominent writer among the Danes in the early 18th century. He wrote many satires and comedies, as well as treatises on law, which was kind of his major thing. Pretty much jurisprudence was kind of how he made most of his money, I guess. He was born in Norway and educated at Copenhagen, where he obtained a theology degree. And he traveled a lot, and he lived 2 years at Oxford in England. He published the Introduction to European History and the Appendix to Universal History, and also the Introduction to the Laws of Nature and Nations, which seems to have done him well after some years. In this book, he attempted to describe government systems and such, which kind of ties a lot into the work that we're going to be covering today.
Absolutely, yeah. He seems to be very interested in history and how societies are constructed, which, again, definitely ties into this work.
Yes, and in that Introduction to the Laws of Nature and Nations, he attempted to basically discuss natural law and link it to how he deemed could be correct governance of Norway and Denmark. So he seems to have fancied himself a little bit of a social reformer, I guess, or at least had sort of those sorts of projects in mind. He was actually appointed a professorship at Copenhagen University, and he was appointed by royalty, so I guess he had friends in really high places. Holberg's autobiography might be an interesting read, I guess. He seems like a sort of a funny dude. And reading the introduction to the translation of Niels Klim's Journey Underground, which is the work we're doing today, I got the sense that a lot of it was probably sourced from his memoir because of just the way things play out.
Yeah, his travel and bouncing around and all that.
Yeah, and also there's some funny stuff like in that one part. And the translator doesn't seem to have picked up on the humor, maybe? I don't know. Like, it's like, for example, he got very ill at one point, and he went to the baths to see if he could get the bath cure that was popular at the time. Well, it didn't work, but apparently a winter in Paris cured him. Like, I don't know. And it just phrased so deadpan-like, and I'm just like, I don't know. I feel like he's taking the piss a bit.
Yeah.
He also wrote a lot of poetry, but it didn't seem to make him a lot of money. And another thing about this bio of him was that it seems like he was always kind of not necessarily complaining about not making enough money, but kind of taking the piss out of his own artistic aspirations.
Right.
And being like, well, it's not making me any money. It was kind of, I guess the way it came across was more humorous than annoying. So I'm willing to cut him some slack. But he had, apparently his friends convinced him to write some plays. Some of them did all right.
He wrote quite a few of them, too.
Yeah, they're in fact considered part of the Danish curriculum to this day, a lot of them. He wrote 25 plays. They're apparently social satires and such, and very seeming directed towards exposing vice and so forth in upper society as well, especially.
Right.
This is what I said here, is like he worked so hard at writing, he says, that his health went to crap, and so he went to the baths, but didn't do him any good until he went and spent the winter in Paris, which, as everybody supposedly knows, is particularly cold and nasty, and apparently that did the trick. So, yeah, it's just... Yeah, he wrote one more sort of weird, fantastical-seeming thing, which he called the Metamorphosis, where he had, like, plants transforming into men and so forth. And that's, again, seems to be sort of a thing that's going on with him. He wrote a history of Christianity, which he claims in his autobiography is completely impartial. He was known for his liberal attitude, apparently. And this book, Niels Klim's Journey Underground, was written towards the end of his life. And it was published in 1741. I believe he died just a few years later.
54 he died.
Oh, okay. So not that much later, but still, yeah. The full title of this book is Niels Klim's Journey Under the Ground, being a narrative of his wonderful descent to the subterranean lands, together with an account of the sensible animals and trees inhabiting the planet Nazar and the firmament.
Yeah, I love those 18th century titles that basically give you a plot summary.
Yeah, it's a good title. Unlike something that I will comment on in the next book, which I really couldn't stand.
Yeah.
And I think you know what I'm talking about.
Right.
But that's for later.
Yeah.
So...
This one has an interesting publication history, too. The initial 1741 publication was in Latin, but then he republished it a couple years later in Danish, and the translation we read was from the Danish version, not from the Latin.
Yeah.
So I did compare the English version to the Latin, and to my uneducated eye, they did look roughly the same, so I don't think we missed too much there.
This translation is by John Gierlo. I did come across another English translation mentioned on Goodreads, so I don't know if that was translated from Latin or English.
Yeah, it looks like the Latin version is more readily available. This translation, since it's on Gutenberg, was done sometime in the late 1800s. I don't remember the exact date of the translation, but I tried to find the Danish version of the text online and didn't have any luck. So I'd imagine in today's world, the Latin is far easier to find.
Right, but this translation is definitely from the Danish.
Yeah.
So the preface is supposedly written by two brothers, Andreas and Peter Klim, who must defend the honor of Niels Klim. I guess he'd be their grandfather.
Yeah, the grandsons or sons. It's I had a question mark written by it in my notes here.
Yeah.
And I also noted that this prefix is only to the Danish edition. It doesn't appear in the Latin version. So it was added a couple years later.
Yeah, so, and it mentions something that's not even, like, in the book, which is this weird Finnish guy.
Yeah.
who basically comes and he's like
Gandalf, basically.
yeah he's this wizardly kind of character, and he claims to have all this knowledge, and he says that it's his duty to defend Niels Klim's honor, and the two brothers have brought him there to make this argument. Pavis, that's his name.
Yeah.
And he comes to talk to
the doubters, I guess, who don't believe that Klim's account is true.
And there are many doubters, apparently, of this account.
Right.
So the book itself is the account that's to come. Basically, it goes like this. So, in 1664, Klim graduates from Copenhagen University. So, Klim, just get this out of the way right now. Klim definitely seems like a bit of a stand-in for Holberg. Seems a lot like him in many ways, including the way he sort of talks and sort of laments maybe not getting noticed in the way he would like to be noticed, basically throughout the book. He wants to return to Bergen, which is his homeland, but he doesn't have enough money, so he's studying the nearby mountains, and he's told of a cave in town. It's called Florian, and this sounds like a name right out of Tolkien, basically.
Yeah.
And unusual for a cave, there's a pleasant breeze that sometimes comes up from inside the earth. Well, this obviously intrigues our Klim, who has geology among his many specialities, so he decides to visit the cave. In 1665, it says, and an expedition with him and 4 fellows who quickly get forgotten about. They're just bearers anyway, they don't matter. So Klim enters the cave and uses a rope and pole to descend the great gulf or chasm that exists in this cave. Unfortunately, his pole breaks, and he's basically precipitated into the abyss. And he falls for a really long time with astonishing quickness, but then is wafted into a sort of perpendicular descent and by some kind of air current. And it's really, really casual description of what's basically free fall. Like, it's super relaxed and kind of, and I was getting food out of my pocket, but it tasted really bad, so I threw it out. But he ends up in this weird realm where the stars are fainter than upon the surface, but they're still visible, interestingly. Klim concludes that he's in heaven, and he worries that he might not be properly equipped for such a journey. And he thinks that the things he's carrying, like a hook and a rope, are not fitting, which I thought was pretty kind of there are a lot of funny asides in this book. But he is in the underground now, and I kind of cheekily quoted the name of an original Star Trek series episode, which I don't know if it's a quote from something, but it's, "And the world is hollow, and I have touched the sky." Yeah, he also worries about possibly becoming a planet or a satellite somehow, which is a strange thing to worry about, but I guess I guess he could become a satellite.
Yeah.
He discovers he's moving in a circular motion, like almost like an orbit, basically. And he remains like this until this winged monster shows up and tries to eat him. But yeah, actually it's an eagle thing of some kind. It's like some kind of monstrous eagle. He fights the thing, and he like throws the hook that he's carrying right between its eyes and manages to kill it. And the atmosphere is really thick down there, so his descent has been slowed, and he lands softly. He finds himself on the ground in a land where the trees are mobile and intelligent. And the trees are, in fact, intelligent, and they have a civilization, and they have a language. They call him a winged monkey, although he doesn't know that yet, but he spends a long time getting introduced to their language. He kind of gets into a bit of trouble because he's trying to, like, I don't know exactly what he's trying to do, but he's like climbs into this tree that turns out to be the wife of the sheriff.
Yeah, he sees this gigantic bull, and he gets frightened and begins to ascend the tree, thinking he's just going to climb up a tree and the bull won't be able to reach him, but he doesn't realize that the tree is sentient, so it starts to scream and slaps him off. You know, what are you doing jumping up on me?
They don't like it because apparently this is a very chaste and wonderful example of femininity in their society. So in the Hall of Justice, he's guarded by trees wielding axes, which again is kind of strangely ironic. But I guess how else do you defeat other trees, I suppose? Sure. Yeah, so there's a judge presiding. It's a beautiful female palm tree. And there are 12 assessors, and it's very much like a standard jury system, in fact, except everyone is a tree. And these tree people are very much like the Ents in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, that definitely was the first thing that jumped out at me.
Yeah, they're very slow-moving, and they're kind of like very, I don't know, hard to, like, they don't believe in ambition or haste or anything like that.
Right, and they view Klim himself as this speedy creature who's just zipping around, and he's thinking too quick, and he's this cunning little devious animal, and they just don't like how fast he moves.
No. So there was one bit that I thought was interesting when I first read it because I thought it was like an example of science. So he's visited by a doctor who takes his blood and seems very surprised by what he finds.
Yeah.
But later on, you find out that they do this to test the purity of your thoughts. But he remains among the trees for quite a while, many, many months. And that's how he learns their language and all that. They can tell he's from the firmament, and he learns a lot about their societies, and that they, for example, pay no attention to sex when it comes to public office, so either males or females can attain this. The judge is a young, virtuous virgin, and I think that there's a bit of a double standard with the whole sexual equality thing, because there definitely seems to be like, yeah, they're equal, but the women are expected to be virtuous, whereas the men are expected to be fecund, which doesn't really make sense. The men are actually held in very high esteem for having large numbers of children. Klim basically exists among the tree people for a long time, and he's kind of not really made a member of their society, but when he goes on a visit to the king sort of says, oh, you would make a really great footman, or porter maybe. And I guess he starts lamenting because they don't recognize his philosophy degree from the University of Copenhagen.
Right. All they can see is that he runs really fast, and he'd be a great person to send messages.
Yeah, and he also sees a lot of people standing around with pamphlets that are talking about his arrival.
Right.
And they have like outlandish titles that are kind of like the title of this book. So it's kind of interesting because even though I feel sometimes like this was frustrating because there's a lot more societies that I'll kind of try and go into a little bit later. Sometimes it seems like they're not fleshed out enough to really get a handle on.
Yeah.
But there's also a neat little bit of almost metafiction in the book where there's a lot of things that almost seem to refer back to the text. And there's at one point towards the end where he meets somebody who's journeyed to the upper world and has written a book about it.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was really cool because it was sort of not something I expected to see in an early work like that.
Right.
It's kind of like real metafictional. I wouldn't say it's like postmodern or anything, but it's kind of pointing in that direction a little bit.
Yeah.
So he's on the planet Nazar, which is an inner sphere, 600 miles in diameter or thereabouts, and the capital, or well, it's not really a capital, but I guess it's one of the biggest kingdoms, is Potu, which is the kingdom of the tree people. There's only one language spoken on Nazar, which is very convenient. He likens them to the European peoples of the hollow sphere. They're now named after the different trees, like poplars and thorns and pines and so on, so they kind of look like our native trees, except they're a little smaller, and they have like headdresses on. They have a lot of technology from the time. Nothing, I guess, super advanced, but they have like self-propelled boats, which comes up in all the works we're doing, actually.
Yeah.
And yeah, like I said, the men are expected to have many children. They get lots of tax breaks if they have a lot of kids.
6 or more.
Yeah. It's always phrased that the men are getting these, though, which, again, sort of belies the whole sexual equality thing. Then there's a bunch of stuff about the religion, which I won't really get into because there's just there's so many societies in this book.
Yeah, I think the one interesting thing there is among the tree people, preaching of religion is illegal.
Yeah. They don't want to explain God, I guess is what it comes down to.
Right.
Which again seems very like sort of it is what it is, right? And it's not your job to try and take it apart or question it. He's a courier for 2 years. And he basically is a mailman, like he goes around delivering messages. And of course he's really good at this because he's fast. They call him Skaba, which means untimely or unripe. He keeps asking for some kind of promotion, but is always denied. The king just doesn't have confidence in his abilities. What you gonna do? Well, here's what he's gonna do. He's gonna write a secret treatise, maybe, and to give it to the king. And the king's pretty impressed and says, hey, maybe you should go be an explorer. And so that's what he does. And he starts journeying around the whole world, which is not very large. It won't be so bad, he reasons to himself. Maybe he'll be rewarded afterwards. And besides, he likes seeing new things. And this kind of mirrors his life on Earth, after all. Because the Potu folk move so slow, they think Nazar is quite large, but he estimates that he can traverse the entire world in 2 months, whereas to a Potu it would take several years. And I guess nobody's made that journey yet, so he starts heading east. And what follows is a huge outpouring of different social frameworks and societies.
About a dozen or so.
Yeah, it's kind of overwhelming, actually. Like, it's just, there's just so much. I don't know. Can you think of any highlights from this section of the book? Because there's just so much.
Yeah, so when he goes to the tree philosopher country, one is so enveloped in his own thoughts that the tree philosopher pisses all over Niels and just doesn't realize that he's urinating on him. So
that totally was Gulliver's Travels.
Yeah.
I think it's the third part, the Laputa section with all the philosophers and their... It also reminded me of the clouds from Aristophanes.
Right.
The philosophers engaged in underworld research and stuff because they've got their asses in the air and their heads planted in the sand kind of thing.
Yeah, the toilet humor really stuck out in that section for that one. And he briefly describes an archaic society amongst the stone oaks who live in the desert. But a lot of these societies are just described in a sentence or a paragraph and not too much more. So it's not exactly a major plot point of the novel. He's just kind of entertaining these different ideas.
Something does happen to him several times, though, and it continues to happen to him, I think, when he goes to the moon, which, yes, that will happen. Not our moon, mind you, But the moon inside the Earth, our inner sphere, also has a moon. But one thing that keeps happening to him is he keeps running into women who, like, try to seduce him or, like, pick him up, even if they're already married, and he keeps, like, having to run away from them. It happens to him several times, and it's always really kind of, I don't know, Klim is really not nice about it, actually. He's kind of...
No.
He's really dick about it.
He makes a move to exclude all women from power, which
Yeah.
is thoroughly rejected.
Right. So when he gets back, he has written this, like, huge book based on all his journeys, which, again, like, we've just scratched the surface. Haha. I'm going to say that a lot this episode because it's very on point, but of all the different societies and things that he sees. But when he gets back and he's written this book and he gives it to the king and thinks this is going to mean a lot, but he gets this, like, really, really tiny raise, and that's it. And he's like, yeah, good job. Oh, now you can go back to being my personal mail carrier and stuff. So now what's he going to do? Because of all his experiences, I guess he's drawn the conclusion that women shouldn't be in any positions of power, right? So he makes this proposal to have them removed from all office, and it gets rejected. He is exiled. And the way they exile people is they put them in a box and they attach the box to this huge flying bird.
I'm assuming the same kind of bird that attacked him in the beginning.
Yeah, probably. Some kind of eagle-like thing.
Yeah.
I guess I don't know that they don't seem to know or care where the people end up. I mean, anything could happen to them, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But he ends up on the moon. And on the moon, there's a whole bunch of societies. And again, we get into some of them in some detail. There's one that he basically joins with. They're called the Quamites, I think.
Yeah, so on the moon, there's not trees, but instead monkeys.
Yeah, there's monkeys, but also other animals.
Yeah, but the monkeys are the people who he meets up with first.
Right.
And
well, no, actually, first he meets up with, like, the tiger people, no?
Oh, does he?
I think so. The monkey people, though, are his, or maybe he leaves them and comes back or something. The monkey people are, like, they're his people, and, like, he kind of becomes their overlord, almost.
Yeah.
And the thing is, he spends the entire time lamenting that they're not as sophisticated as he would like them to be.
Yeah.
And that he only found sophisticated societies among animals and trees.
Yeah.
And they would never accept him.
Yeah. And in opposition to the trees, the monkeys think that Niels is too slow, whereas the trees thought him too fast. The monkeys think he's slow and stupid.
Yeah. But it's interesting that we haven't read it yet for the podcast, but I was actually really reminded of the way he kind of tries to elevate these Quamites. I was reminded of Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court, where this guy takes this society of, quote, backwards people and tries to make something of them.
Right.
And, introduces gunpowder and all this stuff. And he sort of becomes their Alexander, I guess. He calls himself
pretty much,
underground Alexander. And he sails to the earlier kingdoms of the animal people that rejected him, the Martinians, who are like, he was hanging around with the Martinians for a while, that he got into trouble with a woman again, I believe.
Yeah, this happens a lot in the later half of the book.
Yeah, and he decides to conquer them, and there's a huge battle. Klim basically has now the Quamites plus a whole bunch of other kingdoms, and he kind of rules over them for a while, but there's some political dissent. He has captured one of the sons of what was formerly a rival kingdom of his, and even though they're friends, there's some, I guess, dissent, and people want this prince. They think that he should be in a position of power. What happens is he goes away for a while, and I think this is where he finds the traveler who's been to the upper world. No, sorry, it's in the book. It's in the library of one of these kingdoms. It's a book that he finds in the library. Yeah,
the Tanaquite Library. It has a lot of stereotypes of the various European nations at the time. So it makes fun of the Holy Roman Empire and how that's a ridiculous term, and it makes fun of the French and their influence over continental fashion, the papacy of the Italians, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he reads this book and he's like, oh, that's just ridiculous. They don't know anything. How could they talk about Europe like this?
Yeah.
It was really funny, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, he comes home in triumph, but all this stuff has happened. His wife's had a son, and he wants his son to be the successor, but there's a lot of criticism of this. His imperial majesty is in question, basically. And the Tuniquians, which is the other kingdom, that's right, where the prince was captured, his enemies want to put him in power. He has him imprisoned and then secretly assassinated, but I think that's a pretty transparent ploy, and it just angers people more.
Yep.
So he even realizes that because of the power that he has now, he's fallen into intense vanity and not really aware enough of what's happening around him. So his kingdoms are all at war now. His friends abandon him or die. His son and his wife are held prisoner. So our man Klim decides to go on the run. He's hiding out in the mountains somewhere, and he falls down a hole while he's on the run and hiding. And very, very suddenly, he's in Norway. Like, very suddenly.
Yeah.
It's before we had a really relaxed depiction of a free fall descent, and now it's just like I kind of picture of a cartoonish, like, ah! And then, kind of a meow noise, and all of a sudden he's like back in Norway, and he gets seen by some boys. I think they're like shepherd boys or something like that. And because of something that he says, they think that he's, what is it he says?
The wandering shoemaker of Jerusalem.
Yeah, they think he's the wandering Jew, basically.
Yeah.
But it's something that he says that sounds like Jerusalem or something like that.
Yeah, because I think he starts to talk to them in the subterranean language, not realizing he's back in Europe.
Right.
And they don't know what he's talking about, so it sounds something like that.
I don't remember what he says. I don't think I wrote it down, but it sounds like it's not totally random. Because like at first I thought, oh, that's random. They think he's talking about Jerusalem or something. Yeah. But it's actually a little more clever than that. But anyway, he gets seen by an old man who actually ended up being a friend of his. And turns out to be his old friend from Bergen. He had disappeared 12 years before, so he's been gone for 12 years. Gives him a glass of beer, and Klim starts to relate the tale of his journey under the ground. His friend believes in his story, but he says he should keep it secret.
Yeah, right.
And he talks to a bishop in the church. He's given a religious position, and Klim has a good life for the rest of his life, except there's a little epilogue at the end that basically, I think it's the friend discussing with somebody just like how Klim's been really sad since he came back. Yeah, it's Amelin is his postscript where he talks about how sad Klim is and how he like wanders around in the night sometimes and seems to be lamenting for his lost kingdoms and his child and his wife and so on.
He doesn't tell his European wife about his subterranean voyages, but apparently he talks in his sleep about it quite frequently.
I think he's reluctant to get married at first because he doesn't think that polygamy should be practiced, but eventually he kind of acquiesces to it, I guess. It's like it's basically implied that since he comes back, he's very like kind of passive now and not terribly engaged with life anymore.
Yeah.
Because it's not the same as it was down below. Even though he never really he spent so long not really getting what he wanted, and then when he did get what he wanted, it was almost too much, really, and he became a vain despot. He still, he misses that crazy, interesting life, I guess, of the underworld.
Yeah, and it certainly was a crazy, interesting life.
It certainly was, yeah. So, I don't know, I enjoyed this.
Yeah, this is pretty decent. We covered a lot of these traveler stories in episode 1, and this certainly doesn't really do much to break from that kind of mold, aside from the Hollow Works setting, which is so far unique to these stories. But it really plays out a lot like the typical traveler narrative of using the voyage as a vehicle to describe theoretical societies and constructs, as well as commentaries on religion and things like that. And he also finds a way to work in some toilet humor here and there, which is also fun.
Yeah, and there's a pretty sarcastic tone throughout. It's definitely on the humor side, which did keep it from being very dull, I guess, because it would have been otherwise.
Right.
But the humor is pretty good. There are a couple of chuckles, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. And the great battle at the end reminded me a bit of that huge space cosmic battle out of Lucian. Instead of dealing with all these like weird star creatures, it's dealing with like these giant bears and huge cats and roosters with poison-tipped arrows, and there's this massive animal war of all these huge beasts going at it with one another. I thought that scene was pretty cool too.
Yeah, that was very cool. The tree people they use animals, like a lot, like the way we use them. And there's not a lot made of the forms of these creatures. Like, it's just sort of mentioned, and every now and then you get reminded that they're trees or they're tigers or something, but there might as well just be human beings.
Right, they're clearly stand-in for philosophical ideas in other countries.
Yeah.
There's really nothing alien in the sense that we would see somebody like a Wells constructing the Selenite Society.
True, although some of the societies are very strange.
Yeah.
Especially some of those moon societies, like there's the people that communicate by farting.
Yeah, right.
Nobody wants to be around them because it smells so bad, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, it doesn't apply, I guess, in the way that it's not what Holberg intended, but it's just there's too much and it's too quick. You know, it's there's nothing is really gotten into with much detail, and when it is, the reason for the detail is kind of perplexing. Like, there's a whole chapter about the tree people's religion, and it's just kind of like, I don't really know why that's in there, rather than more about some other thing.
Right. Once he leaves the tree people roughly, I don't know, halfway through the book or so, we don't see them again.
No. And it just seems like when he decides to stop and kind of smell the roses a little more, it's like random points.
Yeah.
Maybe it has something to do with his particular social concerns. Maybe that's why he wanted to highlight those sections. I don't know. Yeah. And there's almost no dialogue also. Like, everything is told sort of in a very secondhand way. Mm-hmm. There's no actual reporting of how conversations went. It's more like, particularly when he runs into all these people and they're the women and stuff like that cause him so many problems, it's just also remote that it's hard to feel anything about it.
Right.
Other than, oh God, this is happening again. But, I mean, yeah, and the sexual politics was kind of interesting. It's obvious that Holberg was taking the piss out of Klim a little bit, but yeah, at the same time, Klim is very much like Holberg.
Yeah, you can see that.
So I don't know what Holberg's position on women were, but there were certainly no women in positions of authority in Denmark in the 1700s.
No, definitely not.
I know. So I don't really know what he actually thought about that. I mean, it just says that he was known for a liberal attitude, but I don't, again, we're talking from a 1740s perspective, so that could mean a lot of different things. It just was interesting because it seemed pretty obvious that Klim's like, well, I decided to write a big, long, didactic harangue about how women shouldn't have positions of power. Like, what did he, what did you think of that? Like, why did he put it was obvious that the way it was done, it wasn't supposed to be a good thing. It was like, naturally, the people were not too impressed.
Oh, no, they were not impressed at all.
No. That's Niels Klim's Journey Underground. I would kind of recommend this one, actually. I mean, yeah, it is a typical traveler story, but I actually think I enjoyed it a little more than, like, Bergerac, for example.
Yeah, it's shorter, for one. And it does have a lot of humor throughout. It doesn't really drag in points with the long philosophical constructs, although it does get there in places, but for the most part, it is pretty quick.
Yeah. And it's probably not as good as Gulliver's Travels, because Gulliver's Travels actually chooses to focus on not quite as many social structures, and so you really do get a real glimpse at how some of these things are supposed to work, and there's actual dialogue too and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, between the two areas in this book, I think there must be at least 25, 30 societies in total that are described. Easily. I mean, there's a huge amount.
Easily, yeah. There's a lot of interesting discussions too about work and how societies delegate different tasks and stuff like that, and it came across better than it could have. I'll say that.
I would say,
yeah, no Gulliver's Travels maybe, but it's interesting that this seems that his plays are quite well known in Scandinavia. I don't know anything about them.
No, I don't either.
Yeah, this doesn't seem quite as recognized, but it is mentioned by several people. I think at one point, I feel like it's alluded to in a Poe story.
Yeah, I think Poe was influenced by this.
Yeah.
Certainly it was widely read enough in the Americas where it would have had an English translation in the 19th century.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, it's mentioned too in the Trillionaire Spree by Aldous. He kind of goes into a bit of detail with this book. I guess it might be one of his formative favorites, kind of, along with, like, talks a lot about Gulliver's Travels and stuff too. So kind of makes the connection, the bridge between that and Poe in this book almost.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. Any other thoughts about Niels Klim and his journey underground?
Well, I guess the one final bit is that, unlike the two next works we're going to be reading, nobody thinks that this is a work of nonfiction.
No, I don't think so. And I mean, it's it definitely comes across as something that's not really meant to be taken seriously either. So the other works have a different approach, I think, altogether. The next work that we're going to be covering is Symzonia, A Journey of Discovery. We think this book was written by John Cleves Sims. The book was actually published under the pseudonym Adam Seaborn, and we know it's a pseudonym because Adam Seaborn is the name of the narrator in the text. But I started reading the book and I was expressing doubt as to whether maybe it wasn't written by Sims, but I sort of came around to thinking that it was by him as we went on.
Yeah, it's like 95% for me, I think.
Yeah, it's never been confirmed, but it's likely. So Sims was born in 1780 in Sussex County, New Jersey. He was a captain in the U.S. infantry during the War of 1812, and he landed in St. Louis, which is, it seems like, where he spent a lot of his wartime.
Yeah.
Or in that area, anyway, which is when was pretty much as far on the western frontier as was properly colonized, I guess, at that time.
Yeah, certainly that early, and for quite some time afterwards.
Yeah.
Most of the territory beyond that was still
wild and untamed.
Yeah, right. Though that would rapidly change afterwards.
Yeah, for sure, yeah. And it seems like it was right around the time that he probably wrote Symzonia, late 18-teens, 1820s.
Yeah.
Where the frontier was really starting to expand, like, very rapidly.
Yeah, I mean, the whole Manifest Destiny pushes came in the following decades, and there were some major land purchases made a little bit before this in the very early 1800s that vastly expanded the American territories beyond the initial 13 colonies.
Right. Yeah. He shares a name with his uncle, and he's also quite famous, apparently. Hero of a Revolutionary War. And there's a lot of things named after him. Apparently, anyway. I'm not really up on American history that much, but I'm learning. So his uncle bought a huge swath of land in what's now the state of Ohio. And I believe that's where our man, John Cleves Sims, spent the last years of his life. So he was the eldest of 9 children, and he also produced many children himself. He joined the army in 1802, and he worked his way up to captain rank, which he attained just as war was declared with Great Britain. He spent most of his service on the western frontier, like we already said, by the Mississippi River. A notable thing that happened to him that maybe affected his health later in life, I don't know, but he got involved in a duel in 1808 and almost had his balls shot off.
Yeah.
Apparently the shot pierced his wrist and never caused him much pain and difficulty. It never really healed properly, even though at first he didn't think very much of it. He ended up befriending the person that he had a duel with. So we don't really know why he became obsessed with the Hollow Earth, but it seems to have been the driving force in his life after the war, until his death in 1829. He did have a job as a trader. He was trading goods with the natives around that time. And apparently, though, it wasn't very profitable, and he didn't do very well at it, which seems to be kind of a story of this guy's life after the war. It's actually kind of sad.
And in a sense, I guess we'll see in a bit, he does project these fantasies into the novel, if it is in fact written by him.
Yes, which I'm going to say it is, because, again, like I said, at first, he kind of does some things that maybe sort of throw you off the scent a bit.
Right.
But it's not maintained for very long.
No.
Pretty much forgotten apart as it goes on.
And the pseudonyms are quite ridiculous, starting with Adam Seaborn, and it just gets sillier from there, as we'll
Yeah,
find
especially
out.
towards the end of the
Yeah.
book. But on April 10th, 1818, he wrote and circulated a small pamphlet explaining his belief that the Earth was hollow and contained a sphere that was probably full of animal and vegetable life, and that he wished to make an expedition, and he asked for the support of the world in this endeavor, particularly, though, the American Congress. I'm not going to read the pamphlet because I pretty much just summarized what it says.
Yeah, it's quite short. It's just like a one-page thing that was distributed very quickly, and he had, I don't know how many of these circulars he made. It was a dozen or so, maybe? There are quite a few of them.
There was a lot, and he also wrote newspaper articles.
Yeah.
But he never collected anything into a single body of work.
Right.
Which has made it kind of difficult to sort of enumerate over the years. I mean, there's been several books published using the word Sims theory, written by other people, like his son and his friend James McBride, who seems to be one of his biggest proponents. Also, Reynolds, what's his first name? Jeremiah Reynolds, yeah. He went on a lecture tour with Reynolds in the early to mid 1820s. And this was a lecture tour that they did together. Well, Sims started out on his own, and the idea was that he was supposed to be spreading this. His big thing was the polar holes. So he wanted an expedition to the North Pole, and that was in his first pamphlet. That was what he was fighting for. But in the end, it doesn't really seem to have mattered that much whether it was the north or the south entrance people went to, as long as they got there.
Right.
And they would get there and find all these wonderful resources for America to take in her name. And unfortunately, many contemporary accounts basically talked about what a bad speaker he was. They said he was very unclear, monotonous, his thoughts were disorganized, and he had a very hard time bringing his point across. It's actually seen as a bit of a train wreck.
Yeah. But it's kind of not surprising. I mean, the circulars are very scant on detail, and his mathematical construction of what this whole system would look like is just really bizarre. And it's interesting that it has such longevity, because I think of all the philosophical concepts of these early science fiction tropes, a hollow earth is, to me anyways, one of the strangest, even though it has been in the idea of humanity since, ancient religions. It's just a very weird thing to think about, especially in conjunction with what we know about the earth today.
Yeah, what we know about it now is that there's a crust, and underneath that's a mantle, and there's an iron core. We managed to drill down, I think, over 20 miles at this point.
Yeah, the Soviet Union drilled down the furthest.
Yeah, is that the borehole that I pointed you to that I can't even remember the name of now. Koala borehole or something like that. And it's, we've drilled down pretty far now, and all we've found is certain volatile gases. But certainly, even before all that deep drilling happened, it was pretty much the idea of a hollow earth in real scientific establishment didn't really exist anymore. Although you still get crackpots up into the present day believing that it's a thing.
Right.
Sims likely wrote Symzonia, and it's considered possibly the first American utopian novel. There's a bit of theorizing around that, because although utopias were very popular, the United States was kind of almost supposed to be its own utopia, almost. So
yeah, and you don't really see a lot of 18th century literature from the United States that isn't political theory.
Right.
1820 is pretty early for literature from America, even though this wasn't really presented as a fictional account at first. I think it was presented more of as a nonfiction travelogue.
I suppose that might have been how it was presented, but I mean, that's how I think that's how a lot of novels, especially back then, present themselves, as for veracity's sake, right? To try to, I don't know, it's one of these things that you still kind of see it every now and then, but I think people are more, they want to be aware that they're reading a novel, I guess. I don't know.
Certainly the initial reception was very poor. It was completely ridiculed and treated as a hoax. And the novel remained. I don't think there was any subsequent printings until something like the 1960s, where it was a
Yeah, and it wasn't a real
facsimile
printing.
made of it.
Yeah, I wouldn't even consider that a real edition. I don't know. Like,
Right, exactly.
to me, if it had a real reprinting, it would have had a nice introduction by somebody or other.
Right.
Like, it just kind of deserves it, even though we'll get into this. I don't really think this is a good book.
No, it's not. It's an interesting book for sure.
It is an interesting book, and it deserves something, if anything, because of its creator. And I think we can all assume that it's Sims. But
yeah,
about 5 years after publishing this book is when he met Reynolds. And Reynolds was actually a better presenter and a better speaker. So he really bolstered Sims' reputation, I think it looks like, in some ways. Although they eventually did have a falling out, and it was kind of over the polar holes, it looks like.
Yeah.
Reynolds didn't really see why this was an obsession with Sims, and he kind of just wanted them to have a polar expedition. He thought that, in its own way, would be worthwhile.
Yeah, I mean, people were looking for the Northwest Passage for
Right.
Probably centuries at this point, and
Yeah.
not too much was known about the southern regions, which we'll see in the context of the novel. But I'm sure there were still people still thinking about it for, again, what Sims might be thinking here of exploration and finding new resources to exploit for the Empire.
Yeah, definitely. And we'll see, even though Sims was maybe had other obsessions, he certainly wasn't above that angle. There's something in this book towards the end that really, like, floored me. And I'll bring it up when we get to it. But
yeah.
Eventually, Sims had to leave the lecture circuit. His health was really failing at that point. He went to Ohio, to the land that belonged to his uncle, which I guess is where his wife and children were living. It's funny because apparently he had like 10 kids, and nothing is really said about any of them except this one Americus who kind of picked up his father's mantle. And apparently, as much as 60 years after John died, Americus was still giving interviews and stuff talking about the Sims theory.
Yeah, preaching the gospel until the 1880s.
Right. And that was, that's, a long time afterwards.
Yeah, quite some time.
Yeah, I just don't know. I feel kind of like, wow, his poor kids.
Yeah.
Like, first of all, he wasn't making any money, right? And if you have 10 kids, how do you support all these kids when you're...
Yeah, it's kind of interesting what the revenue stream would have been, because I don't think he published anything under his own name, but this McBride guy and Reynolds both published, I guess, summaries of his ideas and works. So I don't know what, if any, cut Sims himself or his family would have gotten from them.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, did they have military pensions back then?
They must have.
Yeah.
I'm not too up on military history, especially that early on, but I would imagine so.
Yeah, it is very strange. Like, you gotta wonder, how patient and tolerant was his wife, or what was she doing during all this time? Right? I mean, maybe she had a way of making money. I don't know. I guess it's hard to say. It does seem like that he published newspaper articles somewhere.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he did have some stuff to his name. And of course, there were the circulars, of which there were several. But let's talk about Symzonia, because it is the novel, and it is the longest, and I guess the closest thing to the approximation of his ideas in a single work.
Right.
Which we don't really see anywhere else. It's all secondhand, really.
Yeah, pretty much.
So Adam Seaborn is our narrator. He mounts an expedition in 1817. He's overwhelmed by the feeling that everything on Earth is played out and discovered and owned by somebody. And we're running out of frontier, I guess. It seems very strange that he would be thinking this, but I guess, I don't know, he was ahead of his time.
It was a concern at the time, yeah. I mean, and in a way, this opening segment, not only that, but his means to discover a new world is ahead of its time as well.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And he has built this marvelous ship to undertake this expedition to the South Pole, which to me was a deflection because Sims seemed to want to mount an Arctic expedition, but this one's going towards the Antarctic, which was pretty new to everybody at that time. There had been some minor explorations. There was James Cook went there in the 1700s, but after that there wasn't much except a couple of expeditions actually just almost just before this book was published.
Right. And when he reaches the places on the way that are now inhabited and have been for quite some time, during the time of his narrative, they are still uninhabited.
And these places that he names, like the Georgian Islands and
The Falklands.
Yeah, the Falklands for sure, but there's there's the Georgian Islands and what's the other one? Sandwich Islands. Those were very newly discovered.
Yeah.
I think that there was an expedition in like 1818 that discovered Sandwich Island. And that is actually mentioned in the book. They end up there for a short time. But he just created this marvelous ship. It's a strong ship that's basically 3 layers of metal and stout wooden planking that are all bolted together. And it's both a steamship and a sailing ship. It has this ingenious large paddle technology plus sails that can be put aloft when they need to be.
He made the comment that steam vessels at the time were inadequate for ocean and polar voyages, and steamships at the time that this was written were themselves quite new technology. So it's very interesting that he's looking forward even from that.
Yeah, it actually reminded me of a Verne type invention.
Yeah.
The way he's dead. Now, Verne would probably go into it more.
Yes.
Like, I think Verne would be more interested in how that kind of thing works.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
He made the Nautilus in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and it's described in loving detail.
Yeah. Now, this is very glossed over, but it's still an interesting little bit that he put in.
Yeah, it is. And so, leaving his wife and children, quote, to the kindness of the world, rather like Sims himself, maybe.
Yeah.
He sets sail on August the 1st, 1817. The book was published in 1820, so this supposedly something that's already happened.
Right. So he has 3 years of retrospective discoveries to look on.
Yeah. So they go to Cape St. Roque and Rio de Janeiro. They're hanging around in South America. And again, they take the opposite course that Sim suggested for his expedition. So I'm like, that's interesting. He talks a lot about Sim's theories and how that's his inspiration for wanting to do this. But he also says he has some disagreements with Sims, which, again, has something to put you off the scent. Because he says something about Sims believing that the atmosphere inside the Earth was probably not breathable, which I don't think Sims actually said.
Yeah, it's hard to say. At this point, he says that he brings along several books, including some of Sims' lectures, but I don't think we are able to track down any verification that those lectures were actually published.
Yeah, he says memoirs.
Yeah.
Specifically. And I don't know exactly where those... Like, I saw some reference to them on the internet, but the site seemed a little bit sketchy, so I don't really know, you know?
Right, exactly.
We're getting into that territory again where it's like, some of this stuff is, we're not sure. We have this David Standish book, and he really does a good job, like you were saying, of trying to dissect everything and telling you when he thinks that something might be apocryphal, because there's just not really any real way to prove that it came from the original source. And the approach is also very humorous, like... He obviously is interested in the subject, and he documents it with some detail, but he's also very humorous about it, especially towards the end of the book when it starts to talk about, like, the modern 21st and late 20th century and 21st century guys and how they tie in with all these weird conspiracy angles and stuff like that. But what he tells his crew is this is a big sealing expedition, which it is, but that's not his main motivation. So... he doesn't really reveal his true purpose for quite some time. He kind of leads them on, but at the same time, he does seem really interested in the seal hunting angle. He does want to make himself some money, which is probably a good thing considering what happens at the end of the book, but then again, it doesn't really do him any good, so... There was a weird thing when they were on the Falklands. They get to the Falkland Islands, and he basically describes it as a mariner's paradise.
Yeah. At this point, it was pre-British conquest.
Oh, yeah. And it's just the most marvelous place. There's so much hunting and stuff like that, and it's so unspoiled. It seemed almost to me like the first expression of something fantastic in the book, but then I kind of realized, he's just kind of... He talks about a city of penguins, and he goes into a long sort of aside about the social habits of these amphibious penguins.
Yeah.
And it seemed sometime, like at first I'm like, that's kind of out of left field. Like, is he actually saying... But I think they're just normal birds. But they're like he just suddenly starts talking about them as though they're like a civilization.
Yeah, they stock up on the penguin eggs for food, which I thought was pretty gross.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how those would be.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. But yeah, tasty snacks on the voyage, I guess. He talks about how marvelous these birds are and how maybe humans could learn a bit from creatures like that, but it doesn't stop them from taking their eggs and bringing them on ship with them. And they, of course, don't stint. And that's something that I found really, I'm not against hunting, but like the excesses that these people go to in this book, and there's no commentary on it. Like, it's not a satire or anything.
No, Seaborn himself is portrayed as this very macho character who will go to any lengths to get what he wants, including money and resources. And later on, when we get more into the seal trapping, they give numbers of how many seals they kill, and it's some ridiculous number, like in the tens of thousands.
100,000, I might as well say it now. They come home with 100,000 sealskins.
Yeah, and I was just thinking, how can you, is it even possible to fit that many on board a ship? Like,
I don't think so. Yeah. And I actually looked, and I think that was the total for the entire seal catch of licensed British ships for like 3 or 4 years or something like that.
Yeah.
But they're just in this land of plenty, right? So there's so many of them.
And Seaborn definitely wants to stake it all out for the Empire and take everything back with him that he can.
Yeah, for sure. So they push further south, and his men start to express some doubts, and tells them not to worry. He says the cold at the poles is highly exaggerated. It'll be warm and pleasant up there. He starts to go on a lecture as to why he must be right. In particular, though, there's a Mr. Slim who's really not impressed. Mr. Slim raises a lot of objections, many of which sound actually very sensible to me. But he's painted as the bad guy whenever he's around in this book, which is not really all that much. Like, he mostly is in the background, except on the actual ship when they're sailing.
I thought they were going to do more with this, but they kind of dropped it. I mean, we'll see what happens with him later, but they were setting up this whole Slim borderline mutiny plot for the duration of the sea voyage, because Slim doesn't want to risk his lives for Antarctic discovery. He really is just only on board for the sealing aspect, and he convinces a few other members of the crew to go along with him. And it looks like they're going to be setting it up so there's some kind of mutiny drama on board, but it never really gets there.
No, and I wish that it did.
Yeah.
It would have been interesting if we'd had Seaborn on land. And, well, why don't I get to that a little later? Because I can explain as we get to Symzonia itself. But he does try to stage a mutiny, but it's quickly kind of overcome quite bloodlessly, really. And actually, they see land, like, very conveniently all of a sudden.
Yeah, that pretty much dispels it. And I think this is where we see the wall of ice that is theorized to surround the magnetic pole, which I think was referred to in Sims in text as being one of his ideas, that there was like this icy hoop sealing off the South Pole.
The ice hoop, right? Yeah. And of course Slim is like, but if we go in there, like, what if it all freezes up completely and we can't even get out, right? It's like, what about our families? And you're asking, like, his objections seem very reasonable to me. But anyway, they're on this island, and they decide to call it, or he decides to call it Seaborn's Land. It's nice.
Yeah.
So they're now at 83 degrees, 3 minutes south. So they're quite far south. And they basically send a party ashore, including Seaborn and Slim. And they find a river and some prairie and a forest, and like basically it's a pretty big place with a lot of unfamiliar looking trees. And they claim the land for the United States of America, and they have a big party, cannons, and they have like some kind of memorial, like some kind of pictorial memorial with a picture of a thing with money pouring out of it.
Yeah.
So they have a salute for every state. It's all very, very patriotic and stuff. But
they're very happy that they have trees and apparently enough resources for them to winter down there in safety.
Yeah. So what they do is they leave this, I think it's, one of them, I can't remember which mate he is.
Yeah. Nobody really gets any personality in this, except for
No.
Seaborn, who is like this awesome macho guy who's the toughest person in the world.
Yeah, and Slim, who's difficult and disagreeable.
Right.
Even though he's kind of right.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So they leave a party on Seaborn's land, and they tell them, they basically are like, yeah, you guys can hunt for all the seals and stuff.
Yep.
And we'll carry on south. Which they do, and the compass just starts going crazy, and the readings are nonsense, and it's just spinning around. Seaborn decides to isolate Slim and lock him in his cabin.
Right, because he knows where they really are, and nobody else does yet.
Yeah, and nobody does, and so they dare not revolt now because they have no way of going back. And he says, if you do, I'll smash all the instruments too.
Yeah.
But he says if they haven't found anything within a certain amount of time, he'll gladly turn back, and they'll go back and everything will be fine. So they find another island, and now it's really, really warm. And he nearly gets some kind of heat stroke and ends up with a fever for a while. They send some scouts onto the beach, and someone reports seeing the wreck of a strange vessel. And Seaborn's very, very excited by this, because it seems to suggest that there's rational inhabitants down there who can build things.
Mm-hmm.
It's a strange ship, all right, and it's made of a material, strange metal that nobody recognizes. He fires up his crew. He promises lots of wealth for everyone. Now that they're inside, they've gone into the polar opening, but it's been so calm that, unlike Poe, for instance, which we'll talk about very briefly soon, but yeah, there's no big whirlpool sucking them under, so they just kind of travel in, and it starts to get warmer. They discuss the sunlight and how different it is, and it's only directly visible for a short period during the day. The rest of the time, it's a pleasant, reflected light, sort of like moonlight, but brighter. So everything's coming up tops for these guys right now. But Slim is still panicky about the sun leaving them in the darkness forever, becoming completely invisible, and they won't be able to see anything, and it'll all be terrible. But again, he convinces them that they can't do anything without him. So I'd say a weird vessel and so on do count as discoveries. So I think he's kind of got the upper hand right now. Then there's these mysterious 5-masted, narrow-sailed vessels that are spotted, and they're unable to catch up with the ships, but they come in sight of a new land, and Seaborn starts to feel the expectant thrill of first contact. And he says Columbus ain't got nothing on him.
Yeah.
Basically. He's like, Columbus discovered a continent. Seaborn discovered a new world. And
he references Ross's Northern Voyage at this point, and talks about different greeting customs of people.
Yeah.
And he makes sure not to go in guns blazing and tells his crew not to do that either.
Right. So there's a harbor with lots of boats, and it's some weird account that he remembers reading somewhere, and I don't quite get how he makes this connection, but there was something about like the people grabbing their noses, and that's the greeting that he's supposed to give.
Yeah, that was in Ross, I think he said, of some of the northern natives encountered during the Arctic voyages.
Yeah. Now, why he thinks that they should be the same greeting, I'm not really sure, though.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But it works. It works anything. Nothing else works. He tries all the normal things. He tries, like, holding out his hand and bowing and all that stuff, and they all just think it's weird. But so, yeah, there's these short people, very handsome, beautiful, short-statured individuals that he comes across, and he accompanies them to their city and leaving the rest of his crew on board. And the suggestion is that he doesn't really trust anybody else to make this contact. Basically, just him. Nobody else is really good enough. He right away notices their orderliness, their rationality. He has a guide interpreter, Suriwi, I think his name is, and they have a best man or chief whose job it is to basically govern everything. But he's not alone. He has a council that he defers to, and in between him and the council, they make all the decisions for the community. Their society is based on goodness, usefulness, and wisdom. And these are basically the 3 tenets that keep them going, and everybody fits into one of those categories. They rule based upon these principles. They have a system of eliminating undesirable people. They ship them off to a far northern land, and it's suggested that it's really hot there, and these people who are degenerated of mind and spirit also become degenerated of body, and they become grotesque and very large. And it's at this point that Seaborn sort of has this not great premonition about how we may in fact be descended from the outcasts of Symzonia. And in fact, yes, he does decide to name this place Symzonia, even though I'm sure they have a name for themselves.
Yeah, it's never mentioned, I don't think.
No, it's never mentioned. It's just funny that it's like he has his Seaborn's land, and now he's got Symzonia because it's the world that he would want it to be, I guess. Oh yeah, the other thing that convinces them that he might be okay is that it seems like he worships God. But again, this is before he really learns their language, so like how they might know it's the same God, I don't know. I guess it's just because he's prostrated himself and appears to be like reverential that they appear to accept that, I guess, as
I'm not sure.
As acknowledgement of the supreme being, which is very important to them. They live for something like 200 years. Even though they're quite short, they're very, very agile and can leap like many feet into the air and lift objects that are much heavier than what a normal man can lift. He explains the American system of government to the best man. And he says it sounds good, but probably could be the victim of abuse.
Yeah.
The best man's also very unimpressed with all of his attempts to bolster up he starts to call his own societies external. So he starts referring to humans as the external world, and the internals are the Symzonians. Now there are mentions of other nations as well, but they're not really gone into, and the suggestion is that they're not as advanced as the Symzonians, something that might be sort of barbarous.
Right. Primarily like exiles or people driven out or something like that is the impression that I got.
Yeah, so he finds at some point this ancient text which alludes to a war that was had with these people it almost sounds like it was more of an economic war than an actual bloody war, but it turned bloody eventually. And somehow like these people they were not outcasts per se, but I guess they were another nation that existed several thousand years before. It seems like they were selling a lot of good Symzonians, and so some Symzonians got really used to that and got attached to it, and so they became indolent and decadent. So somebody developed this, they call it a war engine, but it really sounds like a flamethrower. Oh, the Belzubians, that's what they were called.
Yeah, right.
And yeah, so this one Symzonian scientist developed a flamethrower that basically scared the Belzubians into going away. And he learns about this war engine, and he thinks it sounds really powerful, which I guess it would have been for somebody in 1820.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a gigantic siege engine that's moved by some kind of hydraulic or pneumatic system, but on wheels, so they can roll this hugely destructive device, I guess, anywhere they need to.
Yeah. Another thing that he does is he brings a bunch of books with him, including the Divine Comedy by Dante and the complete works of Shakespeare and some other stuff, an encyclopedia, I think.
Yeah, Milton's in there.
Yeah, Paradise Lost, right. And he brings all these books, and because they're doing an exchange, he's learned their language, and I guess this Sariwi has his job to sort of be the go-between between Symzonia and Seaborn. And he has also learned the human language, so he's translated a lot of these books, and the best man and the council get a hold of these books, and they read them, and they're very horrified. In fact, they're so horrified that they decide that the race of upper humanity is dangerous and evil and destructive and degenerate and all these other D words. And the decision is basically that there cannot be any contact between the two peoples.
Right.
So
he basically tells them if they come to the internal side, they're going to roll out these huge defense engines and just blow them up.
Right. There had already been rumblings before, because there was this one wise man who was trying to say that, basically confirm the hypothesis Seaborn already had, but was keeping him to himself, that the human race was descended from the degenerate cast-offs of
Yeah.
the Symzonians.
Right.
Now, that got put aside until the books were read. And then it was like, yeah, there's no way you can explain this stuff. Like, this is your high art. What's wrong with you?
Yeah, right.
The Symzonians, I mean, he does go into some of their artistic pursuits. They seem really into music and stuff like that. That doesn't really talk too much about their like literature and stuff, as far as I remember.
No, it's mostly on how their government is structured, I think.
Yeah, there was definitely a lot of mentions of music, but there wasn't a lot of mentions of artistic pursuits among the
No.
Symzonians. They make really nice clothes out of like spider web and stuff, or some kind of web-like stuff. Anyway.
Yeah, I think they use oyster shells for buildings or some kind of shells.
Yeah, yeah. And Seaborn tries to make all these excuses, like, "Oh, we didn't write these books; they're savage island people books.
Right.
We just reprinted them." And he tries to persuade the best man to establish some kind of embassy on Token Island, which is one other island that they found. I think it was right inside where the pole is.
Yeah, pretty much on the cusp of the internal-external border, I guess, if you want to call it that.
Right. And the best man says, "No, it's too hot there anyway. We wouldn't want to put any of our people there. They might get sick and die." Like, at this point, the Symzonians are looking, I don't know, they seem kind of like...
Yeah, they're done with humanity.
Yeah, but they also seem kind of, I don't know, like, well, I mean, I'll get more into it in a bit, but it just seems like a really boring place.
Yeah.
Full of really boring people.
Yeah, yep.
Seaborn is experiencing a lot of shame in his externality, but he comforts himself at least with the knowledge of the notoriety that he'll get when he gets back home. And not to mention the party on the island there that's been collecting all these sealskins. They allow him to leave, which is nice of them, I guess. They don't just want to kill him outright or whatever.
Yeah, they certainly could have from what it sounds like.
Yeah. But there's a big threat that the flamethrowers will be engaged if they ever try to return there. And it's bad because he's been hanging with this Siriwi, I guess, the entire time. And Siriwi sees him back on board the ship. And I kind of picture, I mean, the narrative's not very emotional, but I kind of picture, Seaborn kind of having this emotional crisis and being like, "I'll miss you, my friend." And Siriwi's just like, "Mend your ways."
Yeah.
It's just like very stern.
Yeah.
Like no warmth whatsoever. Just, you people have to fix your problems. All right? And don't you come back here. He goes to the Seaborn's land again. They go back to Seaborn's land, and there's sure enough like 80,000 sealskins waiting for them.
Yeah.
So lots and lots of money. They get 20,000 more before they end up leaving. He swears everyone to secrecy about what's been discovered. And I guess, I don't know how much he really goes into Symzonia with the crew. I guess maybe a bit.
Yeah. Slim wanted to attack Symzonia and steal all their pearls and wealth.
Right.
And Seaborn tells him they have these crazy defense engines that'll just blow us out of the water. And I think that's one of the reasons why he wants to keep it secret from the outside world, is he doesn't want further expeditions going there and just getting annihilated.
But he also doesn't want them to know about Seaborn's land because of all the money they can make.
Yeah, right. That too.
And that's a theme of early expeditions to those kind of places. They were like, if they were private expeditions, they would often not really make too many records because they didn't want other people to find out about what they'd discovered.
Dipping into the profits.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, as soon as Seaborn tells Slim, "Oh, they have these weapons," like, it's described how Slim instantly turns pale and like backs off.
Yeah.
It's like, oh no, he's really such a scaredy cat.
Yeah.
So yeah, 100,000 skins at $2.75 each. That is what profit they're expecting. That is just mind-blowing. And they don't, there's just so many of them that I guess there's no reason why they think they should care.
Yeah.
But I just don't get like how they think they can just keep coming back there again and again and keep doing the same thing and not...
Right. Hey, where'd you get these 100,000 sealskins? You know what I mean? Like.
Yeah.
But yeah, they netted $330,000 in 1820 money. So, I mean, I don't even know what that would be in modern currency. Millions.
Millions.
But
Yeah.
2/3 of that, Seaborn is taking for himself.
I know, I
And the
was
other
just about to
third, he's
say
going to
that.
divide among the crew. So it's not exactly a labor union
It's not
ship
exactly
here.
fair, yeah. By the way, we didn't mention this. There's 50 men in the crew.
Yeah, right.
So it's really, yeah, I made a note of that too. It really seems unfair.
Yeah.
But Mr. Slim is not done yet. He either steals or destroys the Symzonian books that Seaborn took back with him, which I'm surprised they allowed him to take them back. Maybe they didn't know. I don't know. He, I guess, had some books that were consolation.
Yeah, I think he exchanged some, not the Shakespeare and the Milton, but some nautical charts and maps and things like that with the Symzonians for their books.
Okay. Yeah, well, he did get some, and Slim just being the asshole that he is for no reason, because now he can no longer make sensible objections. Now he's reduced to just destroying stuff.
Right.
So they get caught in a storm. It's pretty bad. But man, after everything seems calm, they think they're safe, but they discover that the ship has been damaged, and the shutter that controls the paddle system has come loose and is smashing against the underside of the boat and causing a shitload of damage. Because it's this really huge, like 30 feet long, massive construction, I guess. And yeah, they end up losing all of Seaborn's geological samples and scientific instruments and everything. Notably, not all their sealskins, but all Seaborn science stuff just gets destroyed. And Slim actually tries to seal the breach in the ship and is killed. So there goes the conflict, such that it was.
Yeah.
So after a bit, they get to the United States, and, well, I'll just go through this part very quickly. They get to the United States. He tries to pay everybody, but he goes through this broker with the very unfortunate name of Mr. Slippery.
Yeah. I mean, this one's like, come on. What did he think was going to happen when he trusts this guy?
Well, yeah, that Mr. Slippery should have used his pseudonym.
Yeah.
Maybe that was his pseudonym.
Yeah, right.
My real name is something much worse.
Yeah.
So Mr. Slippery turns out to be crooked, and he basically goes bankrupt, but I'm guessing he pocketed everything.
Right, yep.
And the men are not paid. In the end, Seaborn is, like, stuck with nothing, basically. His sealskins are gone, his money's gone. His ship was, he gave it to Bonetto, which was the one mate that he really trusted. It was the guy he left on the island to do all the sealing. He gave it to him to do his own expedition, and the ship got sunk somewhere.
Yeah, he wrecked it.
He wrecked the ship. So he has nothing. He's living in this really crappy garret somewhere.
And I think he even gets sent to debtor's prison for a bit.
Oh, yeah, possibly. Yeah, I don't remember that part, but that might have happened. That would make sense, because he didn't really have any recourse by that point.
Yeah.
So he's living in a garret somewhere, and he's hoping one day to make another pilgrimage, maybe to Symzonia. Maybe if he writes this book, he'll make enough money to be able to put another ship together. So it's very, yeah, poor Mr. Seaborn.
Yeah.
Left with nothing.
The book, Captain James Riley's memoirs, called Sufferings in Africa from 1817, is what inspires Seaborn to raise money for a second voyage by selling this book, because apparently that book was incredibly popular.
Oh, yeah.
Well, in the real world, it didn't turn out to be that popular for Sims or whoever wrote this. It doesn't look
No. How do you think Sims might have made it better? I mean, it starts out seeming like it could be a decent sea yarn.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of elements of this that really reminded me of Poe's narrative of A. Gordon Pym, specifically the seafaring scenes, not the whole Symzonia utopia part. And the book is kind of divided into, I'd say, halves, with a little bit at the end where they cash in and Seaborn gets himself ruined. But the seafaring section at the beginning is a good 40% of the novel. And I thought that was far better than the Symzonia stuff, which I thought was kind of dry. But if he had expanded the seafaring, sea voyage stuff and made some actual tension with the mutiny and some kind of plot there, I think it could have been a lot better than it was, especially considering how early it is for that kind of nautical fiction.
Yeah. Can you imagine if like Slim had taken over the ship and Seaborn was on Symzonia, and like how he would have tried to convince the Symzonians that the people on the ship weren't dangerous when in fact they were plotting to like come in with guns blazing and stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
That would have been really cool. Like,
Yeah.
that would have taken it a whole new direction. The problem with the Symzonian stuff is that it's like, not only is it dry, but
It's very dry.
It's super pompous, too. It's
Yeah.
like, oh, these people are so much better than us that I can't even tell them. I dare not really reveal how bloody-minded we really are.
Right.
Because it's like, it is kind of funny because it does seem like he's coming at this from a we're spreading the American frontier like imperialist angle, but at the same time, he seems very self-conscious about the faults of everything up above.
Yeah.
So I don't really understand that. Like, I don't really understand if he is like, I'm going to claim this land for the United States. I mean, not the Symzonia itself, but like all these other places that he's discovering. Why would he be like that and at the same time so like humbled that he can't even muster up the gumption to be like, yeah, I really think that we have a good society up above ground.
Yeah. I mean, he was a military guy, so I can see him having some kind of patriotic motivation for spreading the empire that way. And there's this one kind of throwaway line towards the end where he comes back to America and he's complaining about all the taxes he has to pay upon entry. So I think he might have had some political gripes with certain people in the country at the time, and this was kind of his way of letting them out.
Yeah, I think Standish kind of observed that too. And
Yeah.
he did say that he thought that this was an influence on Arthur Gordon Pym, like the sea narrative. I'm not sure I really see it. I mean, maybe the fact that it's a polar expedition and the whole going like...
Yeah, it wasn't really that so much, but I mean more the there's one scene where they're in the internal bit and they cite the 5-masted ship that's just going really fast, and it's really strange, and everybody is kind of taken aback at how weird it is. That kind of reminded me of one part in Pym.
Yeah.
We're going to cover Pym in a later episode, and it's a really weird novel in and of itself, in that it jumps around and does like a lot of things, and there's really not one coherent thread to it. And at the same time, this is kind of incoherent in a bit, but there are certain...
unfinished.
Yeah, right. But there are certain elements that are definitely similarities between the two, and I didn't get any confirmation one way or the other whether Poe had read this or not, but it wouldn't surprise me if he had.
Oh, he did.
Yeah, he did. Okay.
Oh, well, I don't know. Well, maybe not this. He definitely talks about Sims, though.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah, so I don't know. Maybe he doesn't refer to Symzonia specifically, though, I guess. But he does talk about Sims, so there's one amusing sort of... Well, actually, Seaborn says it's an amusing thing, and I guess it was amusing in retrospect. So when he's first hanging out with the Symzonians, he wants to assure the Symzonians that he's a white man, and he shows the fairness of his skin in an area that he thinks might be the least, like, bronzed by the sun and the long sea voyages and stuff.
Right.
And he's very proud of this, and he shows his unbronzed arm, and one of the natives does the same, and they're much, much whiter than him.
Yeah.
And he's like, he describes this as mortifying.
Yeah.
He's like, oh God, they're so perfect.
That's one of the reasons why they confuse him initially for one of those outcast societies, because they perceive him to be so much darker than they are. And he really, I guess, not really that subtly, ties in the idea of an elevated society with the concept of whiteness here.
Yeah, and it's pretty unfortunate.
Yeah.
But it is kind of funny, though, in a way, because he's like, see, I'm not so bad, I'm a white man, and then he's like, shows them, and they show him up by proving that they're so much more
Right.
white than him. Like,
and they're certainly not impressed by him one bit. Throughout
No.
his entire tour of Symzonia, they do not care about him, and they really just don't have much beyond a curious interest in what he's doing there. And once they, I guess, get through the Shakespeare, they're totally horrified and are completely done with dealing with him.
So does this mean that Sims was forced to study Shakespeare and didn't like it? Or
Maybe.
Does he have something Paradise Lost?
Yeah, you never know.
Yeah. So the Symzonians don't get sick naturally, but they generate disease in their bodies through indolence and criminal behavior. So basically excess of any kind, I guess. And I don't know why Sims is on this track in particular. I guess, like, it doesn't seem like there was that much room for pure laziness in the American frontier of 1818. So I don't know. I mean, you hear people talking about that now, 200 years later, and it still
Yeah.
seems weird. It seems even weirder that Sims would be so obsessed with that.
Yeah, it takes a temperance angle, which I
Yeah.
guess ties into that a bit, but it also takes this weird vegetarian angle where
Yep.
the only creatures that are eaten are the very basic shellfish, oysters.
Well, did they even eat that?
Yeah, they say low sea creatures are eaten. Oysters and testaceous creatures, whatever that means.
Okay. But it's mostly plants, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Presumably Sims, I don't know, like, I don't know about his personal habits, but the Symzonians definitely, not only do they not eat meat, but there's no intoxicants or anything like that.
Right. I mean, the temperance thing is kind of a common theme throughout early American literature. One of Walt Whitman's earliest work was a temperance novel, which I haven't read, but it sounds like pretty bad.
Really? What's that one called?
Franklin Evans, or The Inebriate, which was published in 1842. It's not included in the anthology I have of him, which is like
Okay.
near complete. So I think it's
So,
not well regarded in
not
his
well regarded.
canon.
Yeah. Huh. So presumably it's about a drunkard.
Yeah, right. But
Yeah.
quite some time after this, but still following those temperance kind of themes, which was a trait throughout American culture well into the 20th century.
Yeah, well, I mean, I know about the prohibition and the
Yeah,
women's temperance movement and all that stuff,
right.
but I didn't realize that was so much of a thing earlier on, I guess. But
Yeah,
it's not surprising. It can't just come from nowhere, right? So,
right. But the vegetarian thing I thought was more interesting and kind of uncommon.
yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, we'll see that in the next book as well.
Yeah,
But it seems in the Lytton that's coming up, it seems more understandable
right.
given where it comes from,
Yeah.
kind of.
I mean, this, I don't know, yeah, it just feels like a bunch of random stuff stitched together in not that great of a way.
Yeah.
There's really no dramatic tension here, and unlike in Niels' Klim, the Utopia parts are totally without humor.
No humor. Yeah, no. The closest to humor is that whole white skin thing,
Yeah,
really. And that's sad.
yeah,
Yeah. So they find polytheism dangerous. That's another thing that I thought was sort of interesting, I guess.
yeah.
Just as a weird aside, do you think that Sims thought of his little children as little Simsonians?
It's possible, though he did leave his wife and kids, to be
To the
soldier.
kindness of the world.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So who
Well, I
knows?
mean,
But then again, his one kid carried on his work and ridiculous ideas for 60 years, so
yeah.
maybe. Who
But what
knows?
about the other 9 kids?
Yeah, yeah. I guess it'd be interesting to see what they did.
Yeah, for sure. It is odd. It is odd for sure. Yeah, he uses the phrase "addicted to traffic" several times.
Yeah.
That was interesting. So I guess he's talking about like cheap goods again, maybe. And well, he does mention various narcotics, and condemns them obviously.
Right.
Not just booze, but like weeds and opiates and different things, and how so many of the upper world are condemning themselves to doom as a result of this stuff.
Yep. But I guess tying this to the next one is I believe that this was presented as a work of nonfiction, and some people today still maintain that belief on fringe Hollow Earth websites. And while that is a bit of an interesting angle, it is accompanied by some pretty interesting illustrations of diagrams of Sim's theory of Hollow Earth and how the whole polar inversion of internal world or the external world come together.
Oh yeah.
So I think overall, this is definitely in the more interesting than good category. As a novel, it doesn't really work, but it's certainly interesting as a historical curiosity.
Yeah, for sure. Again, there's a lack of dialogue, which tends to make it drier than it really needs to be.
Yep.
Again, a lot of like sort of very detached, almost reporting style, but again, there's no. It would be nice to sort of see more of what the crew thought, or more of maybe even direct debate between the Symzonians and Seaborn, which
Right.
is something we get in the next book.
Yeah.
To much more interesting results.
Yeah. I mean, the crew are thrown in as these like afterthoughts, and we don't even find out who the names of the mates are until they're well on their way into the voyage. He doesn't get into any of their personalities or characters at all before they set off.
Actually, he does this thing, like, repeatedly when he's introducing somebody, where he'll just say, like, Mr. Bonetto, the second mate.
Yeah.
Mr. Mackerel, the fourth mate.
Right.
And that's, like, all they get.
Yeah.
It's the same format every time. And after I saw it, like, 5 times or so, I kind of just laughed. I was like, oh, God, here we go again. Like, Sims is he's no fiction writer.
No.
That's for sure.
He's not Shakespeare or Milton.
No, he's not even Edward Bulwer-Lytton.
Yeah.
But before we actually get to Lytton, I did want to mention there's a semi-direct connection assumed between Sims and Edgar Allan Poe by way of Jeremiah Reynolds.
Okay.
There is speculation that they in fact knew each other, and they both were in the Virginia-Baltimore area, and it's possible that Poe may have heard some of his lectures.
Right.
Very mysteriously, on his deathbed, Poe kept uttering Reynolds' name.
Yeah, I did read that. Yeah.
No, there's no real knowledge of why that name might have been on his lips. And I mean, I suppose it's remotely possible that it was a different Reynolds he was talking about, but the thing is, he does refer to him quite blatantly in the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. And he talks about Sims holes. There's other stories, the manuscript found in a bottle and A Descent into the Maelstrom, that also feature not necessarily polar expeditions, but basically shipwrecks that end up getting dragged into the polar vortex by a storm of some kind and driven into this descent into a terrible cataract. And the manuscript found in a bottle, which is probably the better of the short stories, it doesn't really go into what happens after. It's probably because the person writing the manuscript doesn't survive, so that there's no awesome land to be found under there, but there's still a terrifying glimpse of something, maybe, like at the end of Arthur Gordon Pym. There's a tantalizing hint of something really, really weird, but you don't really get to experience it fully. Poe kind of leaves it ambiguous, which is sort of kind of awesome at the same time. So it's kind of the thing that somebody like Lovecraft probably would have really appreciated, where it's like leaves a lot to speculation, and you can be thinking about what might be found there, and then there's this sort of inkling of something, but it's very stopping short of actually describing it.
Right.
Pym does end very, very abruptly.
Yes, it does. Yeah.
So, and that's like frustrated people for so long. Probably frustrated Jules Verne enough that he wrote a sequel.
Right.
And Jules Verne is somebody we'll be coming to next time when we talk about Journey to the Center of the Earth, which is Verne's own Hollow Earth story. I don't know if his Pym sequel really goes into that angle. I have a feeling it doesn't.
Yeah, I haven't read it, but we are planning on covering that, so we'll find out then.
I guess so. I feel like it might not be... I don't know. I don't want to say because I don't know, but I feel like it might not be as mysterious and otherworldly as the Poe. Like, the Poe just has this real sense of unease and disquieting mystery about it, and I don't think that was Verne's thing. I think Verne was probably more into giving answers.
Right.
So I feel like Verne's sequel might sort of dilute the myth a little bit, so to speak. But we'll see. So, with that said, I think we're going to close the book on poor John Cleves Sims, who died in 1829, his dream of a polar expedition unfulfilled, and his Symzonia undiscovered. Edward Bulwer-Lytton, or Lord Lytton, was born in 1803, and he was born into a privileged family. His novel Pelham gave him an early success in 1828, and was only 25 at that time, I believe. Once that happened, he never gave up writing for the rest of his life. What we are talking about here is a very prolific writer He is a bestseller of his time.
Yeah, very, very popular. Like, I think
Yes.
he eclipsed Dickens in popularity during his life.
Wow. He's not very read today, unlike Dickens.
Yeah, no, not at all.
No, and it's very interesting how some people can fall out of favor. And I've read other things about that too,
Yeah,
where they talk about all these authors that were very popular in the 19th century or early 20th century, or even a few decades ago, that are just not read today at all by most people. That doesn't necessarily mean their work is bad, but maybe it's dated in some aspect that readers find unlikable or something.
yeah.
Or there could be a lot of reasons, I guess. I mean, who's going to read the Da Vinci Code in 100 years?
Right.
Probably nobody,
Yeah.
right? I already think that book has fallen pretty far out of favor from its former best
Yeah.
status, right? And all these, I don't know, I mean, there's always this strata of literature that's perhaps just meant for its age and for one reason or another. But
Right. There's one interesting thing that the Goodreads database does, while I have a lot of complaints about how its information is findable. If you
oh yeah,
click on an author, it will sort their work by amount of reviews and ratings that the novels have, which is not perfect way to gauge modern popularity and readership, but it's some kind of measure. So Lytton was writing for roughly 50 years. I mean, Pelham was 28 and he died in 73. So he was writing that entire time. So
yeah.
45 years or so.
Oh yeah,
And not a slow writer either. He has a large body of work. And the novel we're reading for this segment, The Coming Race and The Last Days of Pompeii, are really the two novels that are still read by him to this day. There are a couple others that had more than a dozen ratings on Goodreads, but for the most part, the vast majority of his work is either rated or reviewed by literally nobody on Goodreads,
that's
which
amazing.
suggests to me that very, very few people are reading them, even though I think they're all, or at least most of them, are on Gutenberg and those other public domain sites.
Yeah, I would imagine they're all on Gutenberg, but I would definitely be into checking that out because it is interesting. The Coming Race, or Vril, or The Power of the Coming Race, seems to be, I mean, it is towards the end of his output.
Yeah.
I believe he only wrote a few books after that,
Yeah.
within the 2-year period before he died. The Last Days of Pompeii is earlier, Lytton, I believe 1843?
34.
34, even earlier. Okay,
Yeah.
yeah. So it'd be interesting to see a cross-section of his work that way. But he seems like an interesting person who's always busy. He was a member of parliament. He started out seemingly on a more liberal footing, but eventually joined the Conservative Party. So he seems to be somebody who had some ideological conflicts in himself.
Yes.
And there's certainly some of that comes through in Coming Race as well.
And like Lord Byron, he had not one, but two novels written about how much of an asshole he is, both by his wife.
Yeah, his wife, whom he married against the wishes of his parents. The marriage was very tumultuous, apparently, and because they were high society figures, everything was kind of out in the open and out in public. So he kind of became a bit of a laughingstock, kind of figure of entertainment, because people were always wanting to see what was up with the Lytton marriage, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, her name is Rosina Wheeler. That sounds really not good. They were married for 9 years, but apparently the end of the marriage did not necessarily symbolize the end of their animosity.
No, definitely not. The first novel she wrote about him was in 1839, which is Chevalier, or A Man of Honor. And the second one was after he died, A Blighted Life, in 1880, about her experience being essentially imprisoned by him in a mental hospital because she did something very, very minor.
Yeah, that's pretty horrible. I knew somebody once who was trying to say that Dickens did the same thing to his wife when he went off with that younger woman. But I don't think it was that bad.
No, I don't think he had her like actually imprisoned.
No, and I'm now wondering if this person was confused with Lytton because Lytton and Dickens didn't know each other.
Yeah,
apparently.
they did. Yeah.
They hung around in the same circles.
I mean, Dickens certainly wasn't good to his wife. He left her for his mistress, who was much younger, and left his family behind and all that. But I don't think he resorted to having her imprisoned.
But apparently this was not an altogether uncommon way of disposing of an unwanted wife at that time among Victorian gentlemen.
No, but it created a massive uproar in the press because they were
Yeah.
public figures, and she was able to escape from it probably because she was famous and somebody of high birth, whereas if she was a middle or lower class person, it would probably just be the end of her.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. She would never be heard from again.
Right.
Guaranteed. Yeah. But yeah, one thing that Lytton is famous for is very pithy sayings that are still used today. And this is, to me, this is really funny because even though his books are not read, everybody knows these sayings.
Yeah.
Like, the pen is mightier than the sword, and the great unwashed. And, of course, it was a dark and stormy night, which he actually did begin one of his novels with, although it's not a complete sentence. It's one of those, like, really long opening sentences, like Dickensian opening sentences.
Right.
Maybe, I mean, not Tale of Two Cities caliber exactly, but you know what I mean. There's actually a literary prize named after him. It's kind of like a fake sarcastic prize, kind of like the Razzie Awards for movies. It's like the worst opening line for a book.
And that seems to be what he's most mentioned for today, is this prize and that handful of sayings.
Yeah.
While The Coming Race and The Last Days of Pompeii do seem to get read a decent amount for stuff that this old, they're certainly not as recognized in the popular conscience as those quotes, which make up a very small portion of his work.
Yeah. So as well as a member of Parliament, he was the secretary for the stage in the colonies, which I guess would mean places like Canada, where he apparently lived for a short time. He was in British Columbia doing something with gold prospecting, I think. And he also, like VA, was offered the throne of Greece.
Right. He's like very anti-VA in some way, where he seems to have been popular, well-liked, and respected for the most part, and the throne of Greece was offered to him and he declined, whereas VA applied for it, essentially, and
he would have loved
nobody
to have
took
the
him
throne
seriously.
of Greece.
Yeah, he wanted it.
Imagine.
Yeah.
All these Grecian women, too.
Right.
Like beautiful objects that he could have possessed. Yeah, I thought that was pretty amazing. And of course, you mentioned Byron earlier, so that kind of reminded me of The Last Man and Byron's own interests in Greek revolutionary Greece.
Right, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Another thing that might be worth noting about Lytton is that he was apparently very interested in the occult and a member of the Rosicrucian Society, along with, actually, an interesting aside would be that the most modern, I guess, sort of non-fiction, in quotes, primer on Hollow Earth ideas, which is just called The Hollow Earth, was also written by a Rosicrucian in 1963. That I thought was interesting, and that definitely comes through in The Coming Race, and I think we've mentioned Helen Blavatsky once on the podcast before, and apparently she was somebody who quite enjoyed The Coming Race and mentioned Vril in a couple of her books.
Yeah, Isis Unveiled is the big one, which I haven't read, but it's certainly it's certainly a big influential work in that community.
Yeah, I don't have that much interest in reading her theosophical works. So
no, me neither.
I don't know. And a lot of what I've heard sort of suggests that they're impenetrable, but not in a, oh, this is really something sophisticated, but that this is a kind of like impenetrable because there's not really anything to penetrate.
Right. It gets very far into the fringe territory, which, even as a curiosity, can be a bit difficult to approach.
Yeah, when incorporating a lot of random jumbled mysticisms from various parts of the world.
Right.
I mean, at least it's cosmopolitan, I suppose, but, you know. Yeah. So let's get into talking about Vril, then. The Power of the Coming Race.
It has several titles. Publication history is also interesting, where it was first published anonymously.
Was it?
Yep. The first publication was anonymous.
I missed
and
that.
Then
okay, interesting.
His name wasn't added until a couple years later. So I think that also adds to it being interpreted as a work of nonfiction.
Yeah, because that is important to the narrative.
Right.
As we'll see. Huh. Because I was just going to say, I mean, that is odd because he was a well-known figure. You would think that people would want to know that Lytton wrote it because it would be a selling point. But if you're actually believing in the veracity of the text, it would make perfect sense that it would be anonymous, right?
Yeah, and at this point in his life, he would have been old and certainly settled down and not in any need of money or anything like that. And I don't know
No.
how deep he was into the whole occult Rosicrucian thing. His novel Zanoni from 1842 is supposed to be his most occult themed one, and that's a good 30 years before this. So
Yeah.
I don't really know what his motivations for writing this and presenting it that way were.
I would just like to mention that I was sent a new edition of Vrel, The Power of the Coming Race by Carl Abrahamsson, who wrote the introduction to the book, the new edition.
Yes, thank you very much, by the way. That was a very good introduction to the work.
Yeah, it was good, and it did go a lot into the occult side of Lytton.
Yeah.
Because that seems to be the emphasis of trap art in a way. So that makes sense. But an interesting thing that I noted from there was that although he does seem to have been really into it, and apparently did things like give readings to his guests and stuff and do their horoscopes and things like that, and also have his own sort of very strangely designed home that was supposed to be done on some weird principle that nobody but him understood. He was sometimes observed as perhaps not being as deeply into it as would first appear, and that maybe his ideas were thought by some of his occultic fellows as being a little bit on the shallow side. Like he was more into smoking opium than anything else. Maybe at that time in his life, I mean, it does seem to have been an interest, perhaps since his student days.
Yeah, certainly a lifelong interest.
Yeah, but perhaps by 1870, he just thought, yes, it's settling down now, and the opium maybe helped him. Apparently, he had steady hearing deterioration, and his death was somehow related to surgery after an infection in his ear. I don't know what the surgery was supposed to remove, but I'm guessing that if it was like that, it was probably quite painful.
Yeah, and 1870s medicine isn't exactly known for being that particularly effective, especially when you're dealing with that kind of surgery.
Right. And if there were regular infections that were causing deterioration and no like decent painkillers except like opium laudanum, stuff like that.
Or antibiotics or anything like that.
No antibiotics, no. So it was probably just painful and kept getting worse, basically is what I'm saying. So
yeah.
I wouldn't blame him for being a heavy opium smoker necessarily. But perhaps it did interfere with some of his occult practices. Who knows? But The Coming Race, written in 1871, details the journeys of an American engineer of some kind. In the beginning, there's a lot of stuff that's blanked out. Basically anything that might pertain to who this person is, where he is exactly, anything that could really tell you anything specific about him. Obviously, so that people reading the book wouldn't go searching for him deliberately.
Right. This is kind of a common technique in novels of the era, too.
Yeah.
From all countries. I mean, the English do it, the Americans do it, the French do it, the Russians do it.
Yeah, I did notice that. I remember the first time I came across that more recently, I guess. Somehow it's not something that I noticed till, like, I got a little bit older. Maybe I don't know how I missed it in the past, but because it's definitely a common thing. But I remember thinking, oh, that must be some kind of mistake. Like, there must be some...
Yeah.
But, it is a common thing. But one day, while inside a random mine with his friend, they find a huge chasm. The engineer goes down for a while and comes back strangely fearful. And he says the descent's unsafe and they should just go back and not really talk about it again. But after some prodding and some brandy, the engineer is more able to talk about his experience and how he saw something that looked like a road and strange lights down there in the abyss. And here in the early part of the book, we get a bunch of Lytton pithy sayings. He who would keep himself to himself should imitate the dumb animals and drink water. So basically, use drink to ply somebody when you want them to talk. And our guy really wants the engineer to talk. By the way, this person in the book never gets a name. So I think just because I hate always saying that somebody is the narrator or our man or some variations thereof, I'm just going to call him what the people of Vrilya call him later on in the book, and I'll call him Tish. Tish gets the truth out of our man, and he decides that they need to go back. Well, he persuades him to go back with him. So they go together to this abyss. They bring rope, and they're going to go down and see what's really down there. So they go down in this cage thing, and it can only take one person at a time. So first the engineer goes down, and they're on this projection appearing at the top of the lower end of a huge funnel. Not only light, but they can hear the sound of voices from down there. And there's the outline of a building and huge columns. Tish makes it to the ground, but the engineer doesn't. The rock breaks and he falls basically a long way and smashes to bits at the narrator's feet. And there's nothing left of him. He's dead. And very quickly, in short order, this giant reptilian monster comes and snatches him away. Just like that. It's horrible.
Yeah. So already we have some horror scenes of the engineer falling to his death, the monster eating him, and then this premonition of this uncanny, otherworldly society below. And I think the start of it is already so much stronger than the previous two novels we read.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And it starts with such a bang, too. Like, he really doesn't waste any time. So walking the road, he finds cultivation. He finds lakes and ravines, mysterious plants, grazing animals. It's very verdant. And then he comes upon this building, and his humanoid figures emerge. And Tish feels this pervading, all-encompassing awe. An interesting contrast to the Symzonians. These people are tall. They're very tall, and they wear these artificial wings. And they have sort of colorful headgear, and they wear tunic, but the biggest feature are these huge wings that kind of cover most of their bodies, and they all carry these long staffs. Their faces are described as sphinx-like, obviously somewhat alien, and they have almost red skin. They can't communicate with each other, so there's a language barrier, but this one of the creatures takes Tish to this place, and there's a basically described very warm, nice smelling place with music being piped in from somewhere. And there's automata walking around serving things. There's an automatic lift taking them down. It's all very mysterious and very otherworldly, like all of a sudden.
Yeah, and this angle is played up throughout the entire novel.
Yeah, absolutely. He does get a pretty good understanding, but it's all very, I don't know, it's strange and beautiful, I guess, but it's also threatening.
Right. I mean, the one emotion that it elicits from the characters is fear. I mean,
Yeah.
They're both in awe, but they're also incredibly scared of what they see.
They rise up into this huge chamber, and Tish starts getting sort of faint. He's sort of been hit by some rocks, I guess, and he's kind of fading in and out. And this child comes to him and starts touching him and caressing him. It's oddly sensual. And he kind of fades out, and he comes to surrounded by these strong, tall, grand beings. And their expressions are very relaxed and mild. And they seem very, very polite and considerate. And yet he can't help but feel this dread overtaking him. And he knows that they're talking about him, and they communicate with gestures, and he starts drawing in his book, trying to sort of tell them where he came from. He sees his guides. They're sort of leading him, and they start flying. So their wings are functional, but they're actually artificial. So they're not actual flying creatures natively, but they seem to have been able to master traveling this way. And they don't flap their wings. They just sort of fan out and bear them aloft. Almost like, I guess they're lighter than air, and they're kind of like act like a balloon almost. And it's pretty cool. You would definitely want something like that. But he's taken to the home of his guide, and he's surrounded by this family, and it's a wife and this guide of his, and 2 sons and a daughter. And he notices right away that the women are taller, and they seem bolder and more outspoken than the men, which is he finds interesting. The guide takes him to a library full of material and books, and there's all kinds of strange mechanisms. And again, automata are walking around.
Yeah, and I thought this was really a cool aspect of the book. He doesn't really go too much into how the automata function. They're just kind of always there doing stuff.
Yeah.
But it's a neat little background detail.
Yeah, they're in the background, and you almost forget about them for a while until the end of the book, when he's kind of in his very dejected period, and he's like, realizing that he doesn't even know how to operate these things. Like, he can't do anything. So they watch sports and flying people dancing in the air. All of a sudden, I guess, Pish just sort of has had too much. He has maybe an attack of race memory. And he sort of goes berserk and tries to harm his guide and gets stunned in some way. The next sections of the book basically take the form of he keeps sort of waking up, and he's often finding himself talking to the daughter, whose name is Z, and they seem to have learned a hell of a lot about him while he was sleeping.
Yeah, including how to speak English fluently.
Right, and it's all pretty spooky because they seem to have had done something to his mind, and although he doesn't really talk about necessarily feeling violated or anything like that, it's definitely there in the text. And the subtext, now you think about it, and you're like, we don't really know what was happening to him during those periods. And it's suggested that it's like a period of several weeks where presumably he was gone over and inspected very carefully, both mentally and physically. Z, as it turns out, is a professor of some kind. She's part of the College of Sages, which are basically the wise people of the nation. And she takes him to see all these things. She claims to have seen many different races of men, but they're all underworld men, and they don't seem to have any knowledge of the upper earth or the heavenly bodies, but there is something in their ancient legends about the people having been driven underground from somewhere due to a great flood or deluge, which is a common theme in so many mythologies and stories. And
yeah, absolutely.
This one they seem to suggest is not even the flood of Noah, but something that predates that by thousands of years.
Yep.
Now, we have a bit of a thing here that mirrors The Sims, in that our narrator, Tish, who interestingly is an American, even though Lytton himself is not, but he is the ambassador from the external world, so, I mean, unwittingly, but he is, so he has to talk about us, about the people that live on the upper earth, and his hosts want him to do that, and he starts talking about New York, and he starts talking about all the great cities of men and all the progress that we've made and all our great inventions and great men. And he starts talking about the Monroe Doctrine, which seems to be a really big mistake.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I don't really totally... I mean, like I've been saying, American history is not really a strong part of my education, but I definitely remember the connection between that and the whole Manifest Destiny thing. And,
right. I mean, it's expansionism, imperial expansionism.
Right. Yeah, and I don't know, if you meet a new race of people with all these awesome things under the ground, I don't know that you really want to take that approach and tell them about that. But I think he feels, because they're so polite and so good-natured seeming, maybe, I don't know, and he wants to make us look great, I guess. So he can't really help himself. But his host is not really impressed by any of this. We sense a theme here. And he's basically pledging him to secrecy, and that he's not going to tell anybody about it. That is, anybody underground. So far, there's been no talk of him returning to the surface, and there won't be for a very, very long time.
Right. I mean, the pit he fell down into when his engineer friend fell, the rope snapped.
Yeah, like he doesn't have rope to get up there. He would need to fly, basically. And he's not... He has to convince one of his hosts to acquiesce to that, and that's not happening. So there's a pretty solemn oath sworn, even. And I think it's at this point that Z starts talking about Vril to him, and all the things that it can do, and including removing things from the brain. And what this sounds like to me is something that Lytton does is, I wasn't really expecting this, but he actually quotes many people throughout this book, from political theorists to scientists. And here he quotes from Michael Faraday.
Yes.
And he's basically trying to explain, I guess, is a unified field theory.
Right.
And Vril is like the ultimate result of electricity, magnetism, galvanism, chemical processes. Like, it's all those things tied together into some all-pervading force.
Yeah, Faraday discovered electromagnetic induction, and there was something else completely different called animal magnetism or mesmerism, which was a purported energy power that people could, manipulate things, including health with. And the narrator, or Tish, is kind of envisioning the Vril, at least as he perceives it, as a combination of what Faraday was doing, what mesmerism is, and these other theories that were floating around at the time, which were not fully realized until a couple decades after this was written.
Yeah, interesting. So, I mean, although it doesn't seem like many of his novels actually are science fiction tangential, maybe a few of them.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on how far into science fiction you consider occult stuff to
Right,
be.
right.
And I guess this does play into that a bit.
Oh, I would definitely say this is.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I don't know, Jess Nevins says that he thinks that this book, along with like people like Verne, were basically responsible for making science fiction a marketable genre.
Yeah, I mean, this was certainly very popular.
Around 1871,
Yeah.
when not just this book, but several other books, including Arijuan, I think, and like some other stuff, was published. The number of books that were published every year that could count as science fiction increased exponentially.
Right. Right.
And obviously science fiction, the name didn't exist, but the idea of a scientific-inspired romance certainly did.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like people caught a whiff of what these guys were doing and thought that it seemed both profitable and entertaining and whatever. So there was a lot more of it from henceforward. And it gets to the point, certainly, where we talk about what we're going to do once we get into later decades. And there's just so much that can be covered.
Oh, yeah. Right.
It's so difficult to actually pick things, right?
Right. I mean,
I mean, even now,
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, oh, where was I going with that? I had something else in my head before that. But anyway, Vril can relate to mesmerism, electrobiology, the weather. It can influence minds.
It does everything, basically.
Yeah, anything really at all. So anything electricity can do, and so much more. An important thing, though, is in the context of this book, is that it can destroy, and it can destroy so completely that he theorizes that it could be used to wipe out a city in a matter of a second.
Yeah.
Or a major city the size of New York or London. This book only deals with one society, and unlike Symzonia, it's gone into in a lot of diverse and interesting ways, and the way that the Vrilia, as they're called, the Vril has so incorporated itself into their way of being that it's a part of their name now. They have some interesting ways of going about things. Let's see if I can just note some of the highlights here. So the Vrilia children actually are responsible for a lot of the work that goes on. The idea is that the children are the most active and the most quick and the best with Vril, even, especially female children. And their jobs are, they actually do all the manual labor, they work the machines. So they have various animals that live down here. And some of them are dangerous. They basically have dinosaurs still. Or maybe they're more like crocodiles. I don't know.
They seem to have a whole mix of reptiles and various creatures.
Yeah, there's all kinds of reptiles, like very large reptiles, and also many, many strange birds. Then birds seem to be a thing with them too. They like to have them around, and they sing constantly. There's often all these references to Tish, how he's hanging out in these places with all these bird songs happening all the time. Every so often, they'll send out children to go and destroy various reptiles, but not only perhaps reptiles, but also perhaps societies that don't quite subscribe to the Vril way of things. And there's an interesting thing. The Vrilia like miscegenation. They like the races intermingling, except it has to be races or cultures of people that possess Vril. If they're not Vrilic, they don't count, and they're inferiors. And if they even slightly threaten the community, they have to be exterminated.
Yeah. And I thought the fact that they sent children to do this, because children have less capability for empathy and more of a tendency towards destruction, was a really interesting point.
They're more ruthless. Yeah. But Tish identifies most with the children because they are more passionate. And this is something that he learns the more time he spends among the Vrilia, which, again, is a very long sojourn he's spending down there. And although his Alfin, his host, who's the manager of the lighting sector, I believe, and he basically is responsible for keeping the cavern system that they live in, with all its buildings and stuff, lighted permanently. And so, I mean, they don't actually know about the sun, but they have constant light, presumably provided by Vril.
Right.
Or gas of some kind, but probably Vril gas.
Could also be Vril arc lighting or other kinds of Vril illumination.
Vrilumination.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, by the way, this Vril term has pervaded a bit into society in interesting ways. We'll maybe talk about a bit later. But although his adult hosts are very kind and good to him, like in general, in an aloof sort of way, they're very passionless, and their attitudes are kind of disturbing and in some very difficult to describe ways, but it has to do with their attitude about things like, for example, they fully acknowledge, and this is something that he sees immediately from looking at their museums and stuff, they acknowledge that their art from now is totally inferior to their art from thousands of years ago, and they're okay with that because they think that it signifies the perfection of their society.
Yeah, I thought this was also a really interesting point, too.
Yeah, because it's almost like and it's so weird because they have a certain amount of self-awareness about the fact that their society seems complacent in some strange ways, even though it's very powerful. But they basically designate that as a sign of happiness and that things are right.
Right.
And as unlikely as it seems, it does make a sort of sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, the idea of art being born out of some kind of struggle or some desire for ideal or perfection, when there is no struggle, when you have ideal and perfection, well, what are you going to write about, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And they have their own pithy maxims, too, which I'm sure Lytton was fine with translating. Like,
yeah.
No happiness without order, no order without authority, no authority without unity. Sounds pretty fascist, actually.
Yeah. Reminded me of the Jem'Hadar from Deep Space Nine.
Yeah, I didn't think of that. Interesting. Yeah, yeah, true. And there's such a polite, reserved culture. They don't say something is illegal or forbidden. They just say it is requested not to do such and such a thing.
Yeah.
But, as he will find out later, the fact that they are so soft about phrasing things doesn't mean that they are soft on action.
No, absolutely not.
No. Property can vary among them, but there's no difference of rank or wealth. Well, a person can attain wealth, but I guess it's not in their nature to really go after it. Some of them do, but it seems like they've reached a point in their society where they don't necessarily think of wealth as being intrinsically useful in itself, and in fact, it can be a burden.
Yeah, that was a sense I got, too, that it was more of a burden than a desirable thing to have.
Yeah, and they often are appointed to public offices, which are positions that they don't like.
Right.
They don't want to have them, so that actually makes them better at their job, I guess, because they don't covet it.
Yeah, they do it out of their duty to the Vril tribe.
Right, exactly. And theoretically, they can have this position for life, but they end up giving them up. Because as they get older, the Vrilya just sort of like to repose and contemplate and not really do anything.
Yeah.
So I guess I thought the whole thing with the children was interesting and cool, but I had a hard time imagining like what people do after that. Like the children sort of just get tired of doing stuff. Or
yeah.
What? Like I had a bit of trouble imagining.
It is difficult to imagine a society functioning that way, but I guess when you have like a magical force that does everything for you, maybe it's a little easier. I don't know.
Yeah. So as I alluded to before, the women in this society are treated sort of differently than they are in the upper world. It seems like most of the public offices are held by men, but women tend to be educators and professors and intellects. They're also stronger physically and taller and bigger. And most importantly to the book, they do all the courting. So it's pretty much an assumed thing that Tish says, and this definitely, I guess, would have been the case in Victorian society, that on the upper world, the men do all the wooing.
Right. He seems kind of horrified or surprised that it's the opposite way around. It does very much feel like a deliberate gender reversal in that sense with Victorian values and norms.
Yeah, it is, very much so. And he's not only horrified, but he keeps deferring to Elfin. Like, later on in the book, Z basically says that she wants to be with him and she loves him. And it's a very big surprise, actually, and it kind of kicked it up a notch for me, I guess, because early on, during the first half of the book, when I was reading it, I kind of thought to myself, well, this is really cool, but there's not a lot of actual story going on here. And then that happened, and it almost seemed to change the writing style too. Like, it just got a lot more flowery, and it kind of reminded me of like some court romance or something like that.
Yeah.
It really changed the tone of it, and it actually sort of really kept me going through the second half, even though I'm not going to say I was struggling with it, but it was just, I kind of wanted a bit more story maybe.
Yeah, I did too, but I'm glad that they put the story that was in there and didn't just have it be a description of what the Vrilya Society is.
Right. There was something there, and in the end, I thought it was quite poignant.
Yeah.
But we'll get to that. So there's a whole chapter 2, speculation on the Vrilya language, and it goes into some considerable detail.
Yeah.
And I kind of wondered what Tolkien would have thought of it, because I'm sure he was aware of this book, and so obviously as a philologist, he spent a lot more time with that kind of stuff, but
right.
Maybe he was impressed that somebody even bothered just a little bit.
Yeah, and much more so than Tolkien, he really goes into comparing the Vrilya language with languages on Earth. He specifically uses Chinese as an example, but also talks about the agglutinative properties of the language as well as some base comparisons to Indo-European base.
Yeah.
He really put a lot of time into the linguistics chapter, and I thought that was a really interesting read, even though it was kind of a rather long tangent.
Yeah. It was unnecessary, but it was okay. I mean, it didn't take away from anything. It added some verisimilitude to the world, and he really did try to build this world up pretty well, and it's a lot more nuanced than Sims, and a lot more gone. There's a lot more time spent on it than there is in Holberg, because his guy is just wandering from place to place so fast that we don't really get to see much in detail. And anyway, I don't think that was Holberg's interest.
Yeah.
So Lytton really does go into it, and what's interesting is that there's nothing there. It's very shades of gray kind of in the depiction. Like, there's a lot of good in the Vrilya society. There's a lot that does seem kind of attractive, but then there's a lot that's really disquieting and really doesn't seem good. And of course, whenever he explains something that happens above ground to Alfin or Z, they're kind of taken aback too, and they're like, well, that's no good. If you really like that, how do you function like that?
Right. And while he does say that there are many, many different tribes of peoples with Vril power, he really spends the entire course of the book with the same 3 or 4 characters. So he gets a sense of their society through this one place. He doesn't move around a lot like Niels Klim does, or he doesn't really get a complex tour like he does in Symzonia.
Right, and even though he's like allowed into all these areas of high society, by the end he's feeling imprisoned, like completely imprisoned. Yeah. So the religion of the Vrilya, there's one divine creator of everything, of course linked to Vril, because everything is.
Right.
Refers to it as the all-good. Religious public devotion is discouraged, though. Ancient books speculating on the nature of religion are also kind of dismissed as being foolish. So, again, reminiscences of the Holberg almost.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of interesting. Mentions made of metempsychosis as well.
Yep.
Which I'm sure you noticed.
Yeah.
They have all these sort of maxims like injustice emanates from a want of wisdom and want of benevolence or want of power. And each of these 3 wants are incompatible with the Godhead. So there's another chapter on perfection and justice, which wasn't too long, but I still thought that kind of stuff tends to make me turn away a little bit and like, yeah, whatever. So, but that was probably the only part of the book that really slowed down a little bit for me, because I did find the society pretty interesting.
Yeah.
By this time, he's spending some time in the town and stuff, and the people don't seem to mind. They think he looks a little strange, but they just sort of dismiss him as being part of some barbarous tribe. He learns about the different communities and stuff. There's apparently a lot of communities, and each one is maybe slightly different. And then out on the borderlands, there's these communities, I think, that don't have Vril.
Yeah. And they're looked upon as barbarians.
Right, so there's a whole world down there.
Yeah.
He's really only in one place. But it is kind of suggested that more or less all the Vrilya communities, and there's like millions of them, are pretty much the same.
But they live in small tribes of like 10,000 people each.
Yeah, I think the largest one they say is like 50,000
Yeah,
or
something like that, yeah.
There's not many shops, of course, and they're staffed by kids. They like sports. They like aerial sports especially. They use their wings. They have flying boats as well. They can fly like 30 miles an hour and keep it up for several hours. And generally, though, the older they get, they're less fond of rapid movement, and they usually discard their wings. In fact, when a woman gets married, part of a symbolic ceremony is that she discards her wings. And that's something that I think is a concession to traditional sexual mores, is that, yeah, like once a woman does decide to marry, she does kind of become subservient.
Right.
But it's suggested that she does this out of love and not out of some kind of social obligation. So, I mean, I think that's kind of idealizing femininity, I guess, in a way.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll buy it. It's okay. But it is that, I think. It's a concession of sorts, but also idealizing the fact that a woman would just do that because she loved a man so much, not because society told her that that was what she had to do. And I feel like maybe this romantic side is perhaps something that Lytton explores more in his other books.
Yeah, certainly the subplots that come up here are the driving action of the second half of the novel. I mean, for the first half of the novel, we get a lot of data dumps about the society. But as we'll see later, I don't know, I had some problems with the romantic angle, but we'll get into that later in the book.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I like that just because it did add a bit of story to it, but I can see how it was, yeah, it wasn't as the deepest, perhaps.
Right.
But yeah, so the Vril staff, something they all carry. It's not just a staff, like it has mechanisms in it, like keys and springs and stuff that control the flow of the Vril. And it has a rapport with the wearer, who also has a special nerve in their hands that's been developed over thousands of years of exposure to the Vril that allows them to control it. So Z, who's kind of been Tish's teacher throughout, and walking around with him everywhere and showing him all these things, basically theorizes that he would never be able to have any control over Vril because he doesn't have this nerve developed. And that's something that her race, has developed over many, many generations.
Yeah, and they won't let him touch the staff because they think he might do something stupid with it or accidentally blow up the whole world or something like that. Yeah.
The Vril are descended from frogs.
Yeah, there's a lot of frog talking in this part of the novel.
Yeah. It reminded me of that really weird movie, Psychomania.
I don't think I've seen that one.
Oh, so yeah, it's this weird, like really weird British biker horror movie, and there's some weird connection between frogs and eternal life of some kind, and deals with the devil. So it's like, yeah, it's really weird because nothing is really spelled out. Anyway, I recommend it.
All right, I'll have to check that one out.
We'll talk about it more later, but yeah, it's good. But yeah, so they're descended from frogs, but there's a bit of this writing of this part where he talks, it's actually Alfin he's talking to about the supposed evolution of the Vrilia, or the Ana, which is the general name for the race. I guess the Vrilia are like the enlightened ones.
Right.
But they've obviously been changed by the Vril anyway, but I guess the Ana is like the whole race as a whole that might include non-Vril people. Anyway, I'm used to calling them Vrilia now, so I think I'll just keep calling them that. Otherwise, it's just going to become interchangeable. That part of the writing, I'm not sure how serious that was, and I actually wondered if Lytton was allowing a little bit of satire to spring through. That whole frog thing. I don't know. I'm not sure if he was that fond of evolutionary theory, maybe? I mean, I don't know. I'm sure he might have talked about it in something or other, because it was definitely something that was very debated.
No, absolutely.
In that time. But
yeah.
Then again, I mean, they are a subterranean race, and I don't know. I mean, there's a bit of going into metaphysics about it. Like, are we descended from frogs, or is the frog our ultimate form? Like,
right. And he also mentions that the philosophers who debated the frog question got so heated over it they started to slaughter one another.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's obviously a bit of satire of the scientific community.
Yeah, I totally thought that was satire. Unlike the Symzonians, Lytton does go quite a bit into describing the art of the Vrilia. And again, a lot of the things that are performed are older.
Very, very old.
Yeah, and they're plays that are often performed by children, and the women are especially really, really into these plays. They like go nuts for them. And I think at first Tish doesn't realize that all the performers are children, but then he starts to kind of realize that, and he's like, oh, so the women are probably into that because they're all parents and these are their children. Like,
Right.
there is art created now, but it's generally considered to be frivolous and often the product of unmarried women.
Also, the barbarian communities living on the outside of Vrilya society.
Do they have knowledge of their art?
Well, they create their own art. They're producing
Right.
new art because their societies are constantly in conflict and changing. I'm not sure
Right.
if they have some common ground with the Vrilya people of some common ancestral artistic tradition, like in the same way that the Iliad would be spread over a lot of Western European societies.
So I was just wondering if I missed that the Vrilya were like patrons of the arts of the barbaric tribal people.
I don't think they appreciated it at all. I think that they just note that it exists.
Huh, okay, yeah. So, yeah, I'm sure they're aware of it, and I'm sure their art is more active and virile and stuff than but he has a friend, sort of, who's the son of the town magistrate, I believe.
Yeah.
And his name is Tei, and he's one of the kids that initially saw him when he landed. He's kind of been questioning him about various things like the reptile that supposedly ate his friend, and he takes him on a walk and they go wandering and sort of to try to find this thing, and he speculates that it's probably hiding in one of the nearby lakes. So while they're doing this, they have a talk, and it's notably a lot more relaxed and comfortable talk than any that he's had with the adults. Like, there's a lot, even some playful banter and stuff, which is totally absent from any talk with the adult Vrilya. So I thought that was kind of interesting. He thinks that Tai, the child, sort of thinks of him as a pet, like a dog almost of something.
Right.
So he's like really friendly towards him. And there's a funny part where where Tish thinks of him. Tish, by the way, is a word that basically means that. It means pet or like little barbarian or something like that. And it's kind of a nickname that he's been given, so...
And even to the children, he's vastly their intellectual inferior.
Yeah, but with the children, he doesn't mind, like, it feels more, I don't know, like, some of them kind of seem to get along with him a little better and stuff, and this one especially.
Right.
They seem to have a little bit of a bond going on, and I like the playful banter where I can't remember exactly what they were talking about, but Tish is like, oh, well, I forgive your ignorance because you're a child. And the child is like, oh, I forgive your ignorance because you're a little barbarian.
Right.
And it's like, oh, that's kind of sweet. But yeah, they find the reptile thing, which is this big, I don't know, big crocodile dinosaur monstrosity, whatever it is. And Tei just blasts it with his vril staff. And he also... Tish was kind of afraid, so he kind of used the vril power to sort of root him to the spot and put his mind in a trance. And they keep doing this to him when he's kind of starting to become out of control.
Right. He wanted to use him as a decoy so the reptile would try to attack him first, but he wasn't into that plan. And Tei was like, well, I don't care. I'm gonna
do it.
Move you in place and then vril zap the reptile, and that's what it does.
Yeah, and they just do this without thinking twice about it. Like, it's not like they're going, haha, I'm gonna manipulate you. It's more like, oh, well, you're not really cooperating the way I want, so I'm just gonna, don't worry about it. I'm just gonna make it, do it, and make it happen. It's just very casual, basically. So, there's talk about the vehicles, and the vehicles of the Vrilya and the money of the Vrilya, which is like they use these kind of fossil type things because apparently precious jewels are so common there that they're pretty much useless as money.
Right, metal likewise.
Yeah. And at some point, Tish tries on some of the artificial wings, but he can't really get anywhere with them. It's suggested that he would need years of practice. That's not available to him. He probably needs some vril thing too, because that's just the way it works down there. Z is pretty blunt about it. She says it's not his body or the wings that are at fault, it's his will. And again, that's tied in with the vril. So, but it's here that she says that she is becoming very attached to him, and she's speaking very lovingly and very sweetly to him, but he's not moved by this in the way that she would like. In fact, he's pretty horrified by it.
Yeah.
And it's really, I don't know, I was kind of moved by all of this a little bit just because it just seemed like it was so awkward. Like, all the scenes around this are just so awkward and horrible.
No, I really like this plot, and I really like Z as a character.
Yeah.
The issue I have with the romance subplot we'll get to a little later on this bit.
The other one.
Yeah, the other one.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, that is a problem, but I think that's his... Like, I think that's the failing of Tish.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's his failing. But anyway, he's totally in awe of her. And it's, like, mostly a frightened awe. The best he can really do is think of her as some kind of angel, but that only happens at certain times. A lot of the times he doesn't really know how to handle himself. He doesn't really know what to do. So he's obviously very horrified by all this, and unfortunately, because of the way women do things there, their sort of prerogative is to be very, very blunt about the way they woo, and they're not going to be cagey about it or surreptitious about it. So she says everything that she says to him kind of out in the open. It's not like she's passing him secret love notes or something. The kid hears what she's saying and starts making fun of him and starts making fun of her, and like it's really bad and really awkward. But there is a lot of talk about how awesome Z is, so I mean in some ways I guess he is not smitten though. He's more like he's just awestruck, and there's no way he could handle it. And he does a really stupid thing in that he goes to tell her dad. It turns out that Alfin doesn't really care for Tish's being able to sort of walk around and mingle with all the women folk. He has some serious concerns. The Aurelia are vegetarians, and one thing that he's told them about the externals, and especially the strong, virile men of the United States, is that they love hunting and eating animals. And the Aurelia are not into this, not at all. And Alfin believes, and they do have some strange beliefs. There's actually a section that I didn't really go into, but that talks a lot about phrenology for a little while.
Yeah.
And there's other stuff that's kind of weird, and I guess one of the things is that Alfin believes that the trait of carnivorism can be spread hereditarily, so that, I mean, I'm sure that's kind of a side concern. I mean, I'm sure he's mostly just like, oh, this is an inferior barbarian, but his major concern seems to be that if they ever bore children, they might receive the taint of carnivorism and also be meat eaters. So he says in his very polite and sort of non-confrontational way, as much as you can get by saying this, that if Tish doesn't find a way to turn Z away from him or to get out of this predicament, he'll turn him to cinders and destroy him without a second thought. It's neat the way he does this. Like, it reminded me almost of like some weird Japanese movie like Branded to Kill or something like that, where it's like the two guys who are opposed to each other and the one guy's like supposed to kill the other guy, but they're like still going out for lunch and eating and like having a polite conversation.
Yeah, no, he puts it very matter of fact. Like, he doesn't have any malice towards him at all. It's just completely socially unacceptable, and he feels like it's completely inappropriate for Z and real society at whole.
Right. Yeah, totally so. And he takes him to his farmhouse while this is happening, and he's like showing him his farming equipment and showing him how his farms work and stuff, and it's all very polite and casual and friendly. But there's some condescension, obviously. Like, he says, oh, I'm only telling you what I think you deserve as a Tish. So it's like, it's sort of, there's certainly some patronizing quality to the discourse. But the thing is, Alfin doesn't want to discuss Z and the situation. He just wants Tish to take care of it. And Tish is being a real, I don't know, like, what did he expect?
Right.
I almost, like, to me, it was very easy to supplant this part into an actual modern, real-less context. And be like, you go to some, like, crazy girl who's after you's dad. It's like, yeah, your daughter is after me. Can you control her, please?
Yeah.
And it's like, no, I can't. Like, do something about it, you know? What do you want me to do?
Yeah.
So, but it is funny because, like, yeah, in this society, the women they can't be controlled. They can't be controlled by their parents or anybody else.
I mean, they're viewed as the dominant sex in relationships, so the male will not intervene on behalf of Tish. It's just not in their societal nature.
Yeah. And he asks Alfin if he could, like, maybe, because he wants to get away from Z at this point. So he asks him if he could, like, leave and go to other communities and see how they live and stuff. And Alfin says no. He says, you might not have realized this, but when you first came here and we were putting you in trances and stuff and talking to you about your people and your lifestyle, we really examined you very carefully at every part of your body, and we asked you a lot of questions, and you have to realize that carnivores your size, we normally just destroy you without a second thought. So it's pretty brutal.
They're going to cut him up and see what he looked like on the inside, but
Right, and even talk about, he says if the magistrate, like the chief magistrate of the city, finds out about certain things, they'll probably just dissect him.
yeah.
And that was actually on the table in the early days, but Alfin kind of convinced him that that wasn't necessary. And he can't return to the service either, by the way. So it's at this point that I think that he starts to feel like pretty imprisoned. When they come back from the country house, there's this really awkward scene where Z intercepts them and she's very loving towards Tish in the presence of her father, and he keeps like looking to Alfin, being like, help me, and again it's like, what do you want me to do?
Yeah, he doesn't intervene at all.
No, he doesn't intervene at all. He just kind of walks off. We see some of the funeral rites of the Velia as well, and then there's a big feast. Music and food and aerial dancing and all this cool stuff. During the party, Z's trying to make him jealous instead of being put off. He's kind of relieved by this. There's a kind of a cool, sweet part where Tish, that is, sort of intervenes on behalf of, I'm not sure if it's Tei or one of the other sons that he's befriended, and helps him match with this girl that he really is in love with. And it's definitely a gender reversal that
Absolutely.
Yeah, like normally he would be like, oh, the girl's so in love with him, but she doesn't know how to say it. And like Tish is trying to help this guy. And it's like he walks in on the daughter and mother talking, and it's like he hears that they're talking about the kid, and he's like, don't worry, she really loves you. And I think in the end she says something and it turns out okay. So it's like it was a sort of lighthearted aside.
Right.
That I thought was pretty sweet. But at this party, though, there's another woman, and she's a very young one, and she seems more demure than the normal Vrilia, and she makes him think a lot more of like young woman of his kind and his type. He's kind of drawn to her, and I guess this is the part that you didn't like very much.
Yeah, I mean, this part didn't really work for me. I mean, the woman that is flirting with him turns out to be the daughter of the town magistrate.
Yeah.
And I think the story would have worked a lot better if it was just Z stricken by him, because he's looked upon as a pet, a dog, a monkey, or something like that. And I could see somebody like a Z, a wizened sage, somebody like that, who's maybe had time to contemplate things and has just been taken off her guard, falling in love with the narrator. But having multiple Vrilia women falling in love with something that would be normally treated with total disdain by the society, or even exterminated, shot with a vril staff, dissected, what have you. It just seems more of a stretch for the plot.
I don't think it was, strictly speaking, necessary to do this. Like, it was sort of an unnecessary addition in a way.
Yeah.
But I think the idea is that Z seems to love him more because she spent a lot of time with him, and she maybe feels like she's gotten to know him a little bit, whereas this one is a lot younger and a lot more like childish in her affections.
Right.
And also perhaps feels attached to him because he's something new and different and maybe barbaric even.
Yeah, I don't know. Still, those urges and desires and that kind of thinking of teenage rebellion and stuff just don't seem to be present in the Vrilia society at all, as how it's described.
No, certainly not. I mean, they would certainly not want you to think so. I don't know. But if it happens at all, it probably happens among the women, right? Like, and there was that other thing that Z talked about, the legend of the woman who slew her husband.
Right.
And it made all the men leave because they were all so scared that they all left. And then the widow ended up being killed because of what she'd done.
Right.
I mean, I guess, I don't know. I bought it. I mean, I didn't think there was that much time spent on it, so it didn't really get annoying. And it was like a good conversation that they had, because she was like talking about how shocked she is by him saying that the parents in his country can prevent a woman from marrying whoever she wants.
Right.
And that's like something that he tried to keep falling back on with Alfin, and it like wasn't working, right?
No, I mean, I guess my issue isn't really that it took up a lot of time in the novel. It is more the inciting event for the final act of the novel's action, and I just wish it had been a little stronger than this bit.
Yeah, I guess I see what you mean. It didn't need to be. It could have just been Alfin.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of glad it wasn't, because, I mean, even though it's hard to get attached to somebody so dispassionate, like, I'm glad in the end Alfin wasn't the one to be, like, this inferior Cretan kill him. Like, I don't know. I'm kind of glad it wasn't him. I don't know.
Right. I mean, he seemed like a reasonable guy from the entire novel, so.
Yeah. I mean, that I'll destroy you if you get intimate with my daughter thing maybe is extreme, but like, he was polite about it. Give him that, right? But anyway, Z shows up while they're having the conversation and literally drags him away, and Vril poleaxes him again.
Yeah.
And he passes out. He's kind of, when he wakes up, he has a lot of crazy thoughts that he, like, this young girl could have saved me, and what if I got with her and I could have a position of power? And he actually has all these crazy thoughts about how he's going to change the Vril society and everything. And he's like, I'll do away with Vril completely. We'll make cannons and we'll make awesome guns and we'll go and we'll conquer all these lands and I'll have all this influence. I'll make reforms. I'll make them change. I'll make society more to my liking. And I don't know if he's just like crazy from being knocked out or what.
It certainly seems to happen a lot to him in this novel.
Yeah. Yeah, it does. And yeah, Z comes in and kind of puts the kibosh on all his kingly magisterial thoughts, and he acts very furious towards her and harangues her a lot, and it's kind of brutal. And she's sort of stoic but obviously feels something. She's like affected by the things that he's saying. She's like imploring that they can be together and they don't even have to be traditionally wed and they could just like go off somewhere, I think she's saying.
Yep.
And she would like abandon her whole community and everything like that. He's kind of moved, but not in the way that she seems to hope. Like, again, he's sort of, I can't see you as anything more than in, like, you were an angel, basically, and I can't be with an angel. He basically makes the excuse of their racial incompatibility that's preventing any union between them. But, I mean, more to the point, obviously, he doesn't have that emotional, he's not able to see her on the level that she wants, I guess. So
he's very dejected and really wants to return to the surface when she tells him all this.
Yeah, and he lets her down, and it's quite heartbreaking, really.
Yeah.
And she mentions the magistrate's daughter, and she employs him to be very careful. At this point, he's feeling very imprisoned. He's musing on how the Vrilia, so much for all their power and their great works and achievements, they still can't produce a great man. And even if the society's more felicitous, as he says, which he has no trouble denying that it is, it's just not. Like, there's never going to be any more amazing artists. There's never going to be an amazing statesman or general or anything like that. And they would destroy us if they came up. He's really sure of this now.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's very melancholic. This went to the point where he realizes he's basically in a cage and he doesn't have any power or control over anything, and doesn't see Z much anymore. She kind of keeps her distance now because of what he said, and she also knows, of course, about what her father had said to him. Because pretty much all he could do was tell the truth. Her dad suggested that he tell her that he thinks she's ugly. But then Tai shows up. He visits again the young child, the boy, and they go out, and they're accosted by these women and bantering with him and so on. Very casual, open banter of the young women of Vrilia. And magistrate's daughter shows up again, and she asks why he doesn't come to see the other family anymore. Then the magistrate arrives, and he just kind of glowers at him. And he doesn't say anything. He just kind of looks very sinister and stern. And it turns out that the magistrate told Tai to kill Tish, and that was sort of the reason for their excursion, but Tai kind of makes it, he sort of suggests that it was a more casual pronouncement than maybe it really was. It's kind of like basically going on there, we only request that you do this.
Right.
Kind of like maybe there's a little bit of flexibility there. This is where he tells him that after they first met and after they did a little bit of examining of Tish, he was told no path between the stranger's home and ours should be left unclosed, or the sorrow and evil of his home may descend to ours. So that's when they sailed up the cavern mouth. And Tai marvels at Tish's fear of death, because the Vrilia don't have that. Tish kind of explains that we can conquer the fear of death if we think that it's for a worthwhile cause, a personal cause, or perhaps a national cause or patriotic cause of some kind or a spiritual cause, but normally we fear death. And Tae very touchingly offers to die with him. And it's very charming. And Tish says, "Child, it is a crime indeed to slay me." As he says that because Tae says that it's not a crime to slay Tish because Tish is a threat to the community. That's simply what has to be done. So he says, "It is indeed a crime to slay me. It were a crime not less in me to say, slay thyself. The all-good chooses his own time to give us life, and his own time to take it away." At night, Z comes to him, and all the sages have ordained him to be killed in the morning, and Z decides that she will save him. So they go back to the old entranceway, and he sees that somebody used a vril staff to rip a new opening in the old chasm. He feels a lot of remorse, and there's some kind of romantic speeches, and she's very sweet to him, and she says she won't leave him till he says that she needs to go. And she says, "Think of me sometimes and with kindness. When I leave the life that lies beyond this speck in time, I shall look round for thee." And it all wraps up pretty quick. He gets back to the surface, he gets back to his home, and he gets into business and retires. But he's written this book because he has a feeling that the Vrilya will fulfill their prophecy of one day returning to the surface and, quote, reclaiming, quote, it, which seems to be a legend that not everyone believes, but which certain members of the College of Sages, like Z, know about and take quite seriously. So they're coming up, and that's the note we're left on.
Yep. Very unsettling ending note, and I really liked that aspect of it. And I think out of a lot of the stuff we've read so far, this is the most Lovecraftian in the sense that we're dealing with this otherworldly horror who used to occupy the earth, and now they're going to come up at some point to reclaim it.
Yeah, and the idea is that they're working on some plan of education, and when they reach some unspecified point, that's when they'll be able to do it. I did find it odd how easy it was for Tish to descend, and yet the Vrilya don't seem to have any knowledge until then of what's above them.
Yeah, I mean, it just might have been a weird crack in the rock or something like that that they didn't think anything of or realize it led anywhere, but who knows?
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like as a flying culture too, that they must have discovered some other egress points.
Yeah.
But again, like, there might be, I don't know, I mean, as much as he gets into the Vril Society in this book, there might be facets of it that we're not aware of, like conspiracies that are, maybe they have their own Vril conspiracies about the upper earth that are covered up.
Right. So. And also, the contact was made at the bottom of a mine, and mining engineering, especially going that far down, was a relatively recent thing in the 1870s, so that could be why contact was just made then and not centuries prior or something like that.
Yeah, but the Vril being so advanced, I would have thought that they might have, but who knows? Like I said, maybe the College of Sages just didn't think they were ready for it yet, and hushed it up. Who knows, right? I just feel like they're, as a people that enjoys flying so much, I don't know. Because it is a mining thing, like you said, so it's probably pretty deep to begin with.
Yeah, right.
So, but there was a lot of sadness about the society. Like, it's so frustrating because you can tell that there's this unbridgeable gulf between the two cultures, and every time you get an explanation of one, the other is kind of horrified a little bit, and the reverse always happens too. They think they've achieved perfection, but they've lost a lot of passion, they've lost art, they've lost individual virtues. Like, they say the few should not be venerated over the many, right? Which is, I mean, I get that, but it also means, like, in practice, that you're not going to have any outstanding citizens.
Right. And I mean, it is essentially described in similar fashions to a lot of these utopian stories, but it isn't portrayed as a desirable society.
No, it's not. And it's almost painful, the kind of, like, the desirable clashing right next to the things that are undesirable in the text. Like, I don't think it qualifies as a quote, dystopia. I'm not even sure I really like that word anymore, but I'm not sure it really qualifies as that in the sense that...
No, I don't think it does either.
No, but it's certainly not positive. It's not like
Yeah.
this is what our society should be.
Right.
And yet there's so much beauty in them, and there's so much that's kind of still ideal, that as much as Tish wants to warn everybody about the coming race, I can't help but feel a part of him probably, if not sort of hungering to return there, because he knows he would not be treated any different.
Right.
But probably still thinks about it with a certain amount of envy almost, and like, feeling that they have all this. And of course, what person of his standing would not actually want to possess Vril, right?
Yeah, of
It's
course.
surely something that would be so beneficial to our society from his perspective, from anybody's perspective, really. But yeah, I thought the romance angle actually did sort of push it up a notch a little bit, because at that point, you really wanted a bit of a story.
Right, and I really like Z as a character a lot.
She was pretty cool, for sure. It was hard to really relate to any of the real characters, but she was probably the one that, other than the child, maybe... I feel like her, because the Vrilya aren't fickle, like I feel like her promises and so on were probably quite sincere.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So that could have been an interesting new angle for Tish if he decided to go like that.
Right.
But he made several objections as to why it could never work, and they were sound.
No, but overall, I really like this. It wasn't completely perfect, but I think it is by far the strongest thing we read for this episode. And
it was
general,
definitely...
I really liked it.
Yeah, I mean, the Holberg was fun.
Yeah.
The Symzonia was interesting, but it wasn't really good.
Right.
This was a good read.
Yeah, I really liked it.
Yeah, like you said, it did remind one a little bit of Lovecraft, and at first we were talking about this episode, and we talked about the Doctor Who story, the Silurians, and I said, well, I don't know if that really fits into the whole Hollow Earth thing, because they're just kind of hanging out in caves waiting to reclaim the surface. But then I read this, and I'm like, I can definitely see a lot of parallels there with the race coming up from a long period of sequestering.
Right. I mean, they certainly don't have the space to move around that the Brillia do. I mean, there's no huge temples with these gigantic columns or anything like that in the Silurians' base.
Well, if they'd had the budget, they might have done something like that.
Well.
But they do have their magic third eye too, which is kind of real-like.
Yeah.
They can do pretty much anything they want to.
Yeah.
And there is extended media that goes more into the grandiosity of them and stuff. Like, there's one book in particular that was published in the early 90s where it's like an alternate Earth, and they're pretty much living on the surface now, and humans are like hunted down for sport, and there's dinosaurs around and stuff like that again. So it's pretty cool. But there's a lot of other connections with other popular culture and stuff.
Yeah, the Madame Blavatsky thing we mentioned earlier, but it has a life several decades beyond that.
It does. So there's a movie that's either just come out or is coming out soon. It's one of the, I think it's the third sequel to Iron Sky, which is that movie about Nazis on the moon. And it's called Iron Sky, The Coming Race. And apparently there's a symbol like in the promotional material or something that's supposed to look like a Vril staff or something like that. So they're obviously taking that on board. In Indiana Jones and the Hollow Earth, which is Indiana Jones tie-in book, obviously, written in, I think, the late 80s or something. There's mention of Vril. The Nazis want to get a hold of it, obviously, and there's like the lost remnants of a lost race or something that has access to it, so Indiana Jones actually goes on a polar expedition of some kind. It's kind of cool. I read about that one. I haven't read the book or anything, but...
Yeah, apparently Himmler was a big fan of the novel, and there was actually a Nazi society that was concerned with finding the Vrilya people. And this was documented after the war, book Pseudoscience in Nazi Land by Willy Lett. How true this was, or if the society actually existed, I guess that's up for debate, but it's kind of tied into these Nazi mysticism, Nazi UFO themes that have been tropes in certain elements of science fiction since the 60s or 70s.
Yeah, I feel like probably a lot of that stuff's apocryphal.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, it is interesting, but I think that a lot of that stuff was kind of made up in the 1960s.
Yeah.
But it does seem to have, like, whether it's true or not, it does seem to have built a bit of a legacy onto itself.
Yeah.
There's actually a Hollow Earth Research Society in Ontario here, and they have something on their website about how a bunch of Nazis like escaped into a Sims hole and they're still living down there, and they have some kind of access to like life preserving machines that
right,
were left by the so this is a thing.
Yeah, people also view this work as nonfiction, as a true account of somebody who witnessed an underground society. And in the conspiracy theory circles, this is treated seriously.
Yeah, and I think we might get into a couple more of those next time. There's some things I want to talk about a little bit, like Richard S. Shaver, but I think we'll leave that for next time because we've gone on for long enough today. Next time when we return, we will be talking about Jules Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth. We'll be talking about Edward Page Mitchell's story Inside the Earth, and we will be talking about Edgar Rice Burroughs' novel At the Earth's Core, and we'll be bringing in some probably filmic follow-ups to those things, and I definitely want to talk a little bit more about some of the weird 20th century conspiracy stuff and how it fits in with UFOs and other cool stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot to go over there.
Yeah. Thanks for tuning in, and you can find us at anchor.fm/chrononauts or
chrononautspodcast.blogspot.com. Also on Twitter at chrononautsSF and Facebook at Chrononauts Podcast.
Yeah, and that's it. Remember to keep your Vril staff charged and beware of the Sims holes.
We'll see you next time.
Good night.